The cardiac monitor screamed. Inside Harlow Medical Center in Colorado Springs, a decorated Navy commander grabbed a nurse by the arm and physically shoved her away from his dying father's bedside. "You're done here. Get out." Every doctor in the ICU froze. The nurse didn't flinch. What Commander Derek Voss didn't know, what no one in that hospital knew, was that the quiet woman he just humiliated had once pulled injured soldiers out of burning helicopters under enemy fire, had once been awarded the Bronze Star for action so classified, most of her records still didn't exist in any public database. He had just made the worst mistake of his life. The overnight shift at Harlow Medical Center didn't start with the alarm, it started with the coffee. Nurse Lena Krause had been standing at the workstation near ICU Bay 6 for 11 minutes, waiting for the ancient break-room coffee maker to finish its cycle when she first noticed the family. A man in his early 40s, navy dress whites, jaw tight enough to crack a walnut. Two younger people flanking him. A woman in her 30s gripping a phone. A teenage boy with earbuds dangling loose around his neck, forgotten. They moved through the corridor the way military families always moved through hospitals, like they were approaching a command briefing they hadn't prepared for and couldn't afford to fail. Lena watched them stop at the nurse's station, watched the man in uniform lean forward over the counter in a way that wasn't quite aggressive, but was clearly meant to signal that he expected to be answered immediately. She picked up her coffee. She had seen that posture before, on 3 continents. Across the ICU floor in Bay 6, Nurse Claire Dempsey was already at the bedside of General Raymond Voss, age 71, admitted 6 hours earlier with acute aortic dissection complicated by a developing pericardial effusion. She had read his chart twice. She had reviewed the cardiothoracic consult notes. She had checked his lines, his drips, his output. She had done all of this without being asked because that was how she did everything. The general was asleep, or something close to it. A fitful, medicated half-consciousness that wasn't really rest. His color was poor. The monitors told a story that Claire didn't like. Blood pressure trending downward in slow, stubborn increments. Heart rate elevated just enough to mean the body was working harder than it should. The pericardial effusion wasn't critical yet, but yet was doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. She adjusted the drip rate by 2 milliliters, noted it in the chart, and was checking the position of the arterial line when she heard the footsteps. Not the soft rubber sole shuffle of hospital staff. The hard, deliberate knock of dress shoes on linoleum. She didn't turn around. "Who are you?" The voice landed flat and immediate. No warm-up, no courtesy. Claire finished checking the line before she responded. "Claire Dempsey, I'm your father's primary ICU nurse on this shift." She turned then. The man was already inside the bay, which visitors weren't supposed to be, not without clearing the desk. He was taller than she'd expected from the sound of the footsteps. Commander's insignia. The name tape on his uniform read Voss. "Where's the attending?" "Dr. Halverson is on call. He's been paged. He'll be here shortly." "Shortly isn't good enough. My father is in critical condition and I want the attending physician at this bedside right now, not a nurse." Claire looked at him once, steadily, and then looked back at the monitor. "Your father is stable. His pressure has been trending down slightly and we're managing it. The cardiothoracic team has been notified and—" "Did you hear what I said?" He moved closer, not toward the bed, toward her. "I want the physician. I don't want your nursing assessment. I want the actual doctor." "Commander Voss," she kept her voice level. "I understand you're frightened. That's a reasonable response to what you're going through tonight. But I need you to step back and let me do my job." The word frightened landed wrong. She saw it happen, saw something shift in his face, the jaw tighten further, the skin around his eyes go cold. "Frightened." He said it like she'd insulted him in a foreign language. "I'm not frightened. I'm concerned that my father's care is being managed by someone who—" He looked her over, a quick, dismissive scan from shoes to ponytail. "You're what, a floor nurse? You've been doing this, what, 5 years? 10? 17, Claire said. "That's not the kind of experience I'm talking about." She reached past him. He didn't move, so she moved around him, to adjust the secondary IV bag that had slipped slightly off its hook. She noted the time in her mental log. She did not say anything else. He was still talking. She was aware of that the way you're aware of a television on in another room. The words broke against her without finding purchase. She had been yelled at by men with guns. She had been yelled at in 3 languages simultaneously while managing a hemorrhaging femoral artery in 110-degree heat. Derek Voss, in his dress whites, in a climate-controlled ICU in Colorado Springs, was loud, but he wasn't anything she hadn't already survived. Dr. Halverson arrived 6 minutes later, which was fast by any reasonable standard. He was 43, competent, mildly harassed-looking, still pulling his white coat straight as he came through the bay entrance. He'd been asleep in the on-call room. "Commander Voss," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Dr. Halverson, your father's attending physician. I understand you have some concerns. I want a specialist, a cardiothoracic surgeon at this bedside, tonight. Not tomorrow morning, not in the morning after rounds, tonight. The cardiothoracic team has been consulted and they're aware of your father's—" "Consulted isn't the same as present." He said it the way you say something you've been waiting to say. "I have access to some of the best cardiac surgeons on the East Coast. I want to arrange a transfer to a facility that can give him the level of care he—" "That's not advisable." Claire said it quietly from the other side of the bed, where she had moved without anyone noticing. She was checking the arterial line reading again. Both men looked at her. "His pressure," she said, not making it dramatic, just stating a fact. "It's dropped 4 points in the last 8 minutes. Moving him right now would put him in real danger." Halverson looked at the monitor. The numbers confirmed it. "She's right," he said, with the slightly deflated tone of a man who hadn't been the first to notice. "Commander, a transfer at this stage of his presentation is genuinely risky. If the effusion develops the way I'm concerned it might, he needs to be here where we can respond immediately." Derek Voss looked at the monitor, then at his father, then at Claire, with an expression that had calculation in it, like he was trying to find the angle where her assessment became dismissible. "What's your read on the effusion?" he asked, and for a second Claire thought he was asking her, but he turned to Halverson. Halverson gave a careful answer. Plausible, thorough, missing 2 things Claire had noticed in the chart, and hadn't mentioned yet because they weren't urgent enough to interrupt, but would be relevant in the next 2 hours. She made a note to flag them at the shift change. Derek Voss was nodding at Halverson's answer with the focused attention of someone who understood enough medical terminology to follow, but not enough to question. Claire had met this type before. Not stupid, not negligent, just accustomed to being the most important person in every room, and therefore accustomed to everyone else organizing themselves around that fact. She went back to her monitoring. She let Halverson handle the family conversation. That was the right division of labor. She wasn't trying to manage Derek Voss. She was trying to keep his father alive, and those were not the same task. It was Lena who appeared at the bay door 20 minutes later, coffee in hand, with an expression that said something specific had happened. "Pharmacy confirmed the adjusted order," she said, catching Claire's eye, speaking in the shorthand of people who had worked together for 3 years. "And, he went to the desk." "Which desk?" "Administration, night supervisor." Claire absorbed this. "What did he say?" "Complained about nursing care. Used the phrase inappropriately managing family communication. Nancy took the call." Nancy was the night supervisor. Nancy was good at her job and generally unimpressed by people who complained about nursing care at 11:30 p.m. Claire nodded once and returned her attention to the general's chart. The next hour was quiet in the procedural sense. Vitals were checked on schedule. The effusion was monitored. Derek Voss sat in the family waiting room with his sister and his nephew and did not return to Base 6, which was either self-restraint or strategy. Claire completed her documentation. She reviewed the echocardiogram results from admission, comparing them against the baseline the ER had captured. There was something in the left ventricular wall motion that she hadn't liked when she first saw it, and she liked it less now. She sent a message to Halverson flagging it. He replied 9 minutes later that he'd noted it and had already added it to the cardiothoracic consult request. Good, she thought. We're on the same page. She was charting at the workstation, the ICU, at the particular late-night frequency that experienced nurses learn to read like weather, the monitor rhythms, the ventilator cycles, the muted conversations at the desk, when Derek Voss walked back onto the floor. He wasn't alone. He had Nancy with him. Nancy's face was professionally neutral in the way that Nancy's face only got when she was managing something she didn't enjoy. She caught Claire's eyes, and something passed between them that Nancy probably thought was invisible to a non-nurse. It wasn't. Ms. Dempsey. Nancy stopped a foot from the workstation. Commander Voss has requested a change in the primary nursing assignment for his father. He'd like Marcus on the case. Marcus was a good nurse. He was also 29 and had been working in the ICU for 4 years. That's Nancy's call to make, Claire said. She was already standing, already straightening the charts she'd been reviewing because she understood the landscape. There was the right answer, which was that reassigning a primary nurse mid-monitoring for a deteriorating patient was not clinically indicated and introduced unnecessary risk. And there was the functional answer, which was that fighting this battle openly, on the floor, in front of Derek Voss, served no one. She chose neither out loud. I'd like to complete the next vitals check and brief Marcus directly, she said to Nancy. 20 minutes. Nancy looked at Voss. Voss looked at Claire with the expression of someone who had won a thing and found it slightly less satisfying than expected. Fine, he said. She went back to Bay 6. The general's eyes were open. That was new. She hadn't seen him conscious since he'd come up from the ER. And the alertness in his gaze, however dim, meant his brain was still fighting. Hey, she said, the same way she said it to everyone. Not soft and theatrical, just direct. General Voss, I'm Claire. I've been watching you tonight. His lips moved. She leaned in. My son, he managed. He's here. He's in the waiting room. Something passed across his face. She couldn't tell if it was relief or something more complicated. Gave you trouble, the general said. It wasn't quite a question. He's worried about you, she said, which was true. Stubborn, the old man said, and he might have been talking about his son or about himself. She checked his pressure. It had dropped again. Not catastrophically, but persistently. The kind of slow drift that she had learned over 17 years and 2 combat deployments and 1 field hospital in a building that had partially collapsed around her was sometimes more dangerous than a sudden crash. She rechecked the echo numbers in her head. The left ventricular wall motion, the trending pressure, the effusion rate. Something was developing. She could feel it the way you feel weather changing when you've spent enough time outside. Not a measurement, not a data point, just the accumulated intelligence of having paid attention for long enough. She flagged Halverson again. This time she didn't frame it as a note. She called him directly. I want to talk about Beck's triad, she said when he answered. Not as a hypothetical. Beck's triad. Falling blood pressure, muffled heart sounds, distended jugular veins. The classic presentation of cardiac tamponade, the pericardial sac filling with fluid until it compressed the heart like a fist closing. There was a pause on the other end. You're seeing all 3? I'm seeing the pressure trajectory, and I'm not loving the JVP on the last check. Heart sounds were muffled on admission and haven't improved. I think we're moving faster than the echo suggested. I'll be there in 4 minutes. She stood at the bedside and watched the monitor. The general had drifted back into that half-conscious state. His breathing was slightly more labored than it had been 40 minutes ago. The machine was accurate. The machine told her numbers. The numbers were concerning. She had stopped somewhere in her career, she couldn't pinpoint exactly when. Thinking of patients as collections of numbers with a body attached, it had happened the other direction. The body first, the numbers as translation. She was still watching him when Derek Voss came back through the bay door. He had changed out of part of his uniform, jacket off, sleeves still pressed, collar still buttoned. He looked like a man who had tried to downgrade his authority and couldn't quite manage it. I thought you were handing off, he said. I will. I'm waiting for the attending. Why? Because I flagged something in your father's vitals, and I want to brief the physician before I transfer care. He looked at the monitor. His eyes tracked the numbers with the focused attention of someone who had looked up what the numbers meant sometime in the last hour. What did you flag? She looked at him. Ask Dr. Halverson. That's his role. I'm asking you. Claire looked back at the monitor. Your father's pericardial effusion may be progressing to tamponade. That means fluid is building around the heart and starting to compress it. If I'm right, it needs to be addressed quickly. If I'm wrong, no harm done. Either way, I'm not leaving until the attending confirms the assessment. Silence. Then, you couldn't have caught this earlier? She absorbed that, let it settle before she answered. I flagged it an hour ago. Dr. Halverson and I have been monitoring. This is what monitoring looks like. Derek Voss stared at her. She could see the shape of what he wanted to say organizing itself behind his eyes. Something about competence, something about earlier detection, something about why wasn't a specialist here. And she watched him choose, slowly, not to say it. Halverson arrived. The next 3 minutes were medical. Claire gave him the rundown. Pressure trajectory, respiratory changes, JVP assessment, the echo comparison. Halverson listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she respected about him. He examined the general. He listened to the heart sounds, and his face changed slightly, the way physician faces change when something confirms a concern they were hoping would prove unfounded. "I'm calling cardiothoracic in now," he said. "Not a consult. Active." He was already on his phone as he walked out of the bay. Derek Voss was still standing near the door. His arms had dropped from the crossed position they'd been in for most of the conversation. He was watching his father. "What happens if it is tamponade?" he asked. He wasn't asking her exactly, more like asking the air, but she was the one there. "A procedure called pericardiocentesis," Claire said. "A needle to drain the fluid. It sounds worse than it is. When it's done correctly, results are usually fast." "Usually." "In competent hands," she said. "Yes." She started preparing for it, because Halverson would want the tray ready, and because whoever ended up at this bedside in the next 20 minutes would need it. Moving with the economical efficiency of someone who had done this in conditions where economy of movement was the difference between outcomes. She pulled the cart. She confirmed the supplies. She checked the ultrasound unit in the corner of the bay, a precautionary check. The kind of thing you did not because you doubted the equipment, but because doubting the equipment was part of the job. Derek Voss watched her. She was aware of it, not uncomfortable. She had been watched by commanding officers in worse conditions. She worked. "You've done this before," he said. It came out flatter than an accusation, not quite a question. "Done what before?" "This." He made a vague gesture at the room, the equipment, the situation. "This specific thing." She looked at him once. "Prepared for a pericardiocentesis?" "Been calm when things are going wrong." She went back to the cart. "I've been calm in worse situations." She heard him take a breath, heard the pause in it, the thing that lives in a pause before a person says something they're unsure they should say. "Where?" he asked. She placed the second sterile drape on the cart with care. "Somewhere that's not on my resume," she said, and she left it there, and she did not look at him again. Halverson returned with Dr. Sung from cardiothoracic, who was sharp-eyed and unhurried in the way of surgeons who had seen real emergencies, and could therefore distinguish them from situations that merely felt like emergencies. She reviewed the chart, reviewed the monitor, examined the general with practiced economy. "She's right," Sung said to Halverson, with a nod in Claire's direction that might have been the least dramatic form of professional acknowledgement Claire had received in 6 months. "We're looking at early tamponade. We need to act." Halverson looked at Voss. "Commander, we need to begin a procedure to drain the fluid around your father's heart. It's urgent." Derek Voss looked at his father, at the monitors, at Claire's tray, already prepared, already set. And something shifted in his face. Not softness, something older than softness. The specific expression of a person who has spent their life in control of outcomes encountering a situation where they are, definitively, not. "Do it," he said. He moved to the wall. Out of the way. Claire was already gloved. It was Sung who performed the procedure, Halverson who assisted, Claire who managed the monitoring and the equipment and the workflow of the bay with the seamless competence of someone who had run far more chaotic spaces than this one. She handed instruments before they were requested. She tracked the drainage output in real time. She watched the pressure numbers and called them every 90 seconds. The general's pressure steadied, then rose. Not dramatically, not the Hollywood version. Just a gradual, stubborn climb back toward viable, the kind that happened when you removed the thing that was crushing a heart and let it do the work it had been trying to do. The procedure took 22 minutes. When it was over, when the general was breathing easier and the numbers were moving in the right direction and Sung was documenting and Halverson was updating the chart, Claire stepped back and stripped her gloves and dropped them in the waste bin and rolled her neck once, just once, the particular fatigue of sustained concentration releasing itself. She looked at the monitor. She looked at the general. He was more awake than he'd been in 3 hours. His color was better. His breathing was slower, which counterintuitively meant it was better. Sung said something to Halverson about transfer protocols. Halverson said something back. Claire made a note in the chart that was 3 lines long and captured everything that needed capturing. She was not looking at Derek Voss, but she heard him. He was on his phone, voice low, somewhere near the bay door. She caught only fragments. Stable now. Yes, they did no, it was fast. The nurse... A pause. Yeah, I know. She gathered her documentation and started toward the workstation. She passed him on the way out. He said nothing. She said nothing. She was almost back to the workstation when she heard Sung say, behind her, to no one in particular, or possibly to Halverson, "Somebody flagged that early. Good catch." Nobody answered, but Marcus, passing Claire at the nurse's station, pointed 2 fingers in her direction in the wordless gesture that meant, "That was you," and Claire took her coffee, still there, still warm enough, and sat down at the workstation and opened the next chart and kept working. Lena appeared at her shoulder 10 minutes later. "Nancy wants a word," Lena said. "About?" "He filed a complaint." She said it quietly. "Formal one. I heard him on the phone with someone." Claire set her coffees down. She looked at the bay, where the general was resting and the numbers were finally doing what numbers should do. She looked at Lena. "Okay," she said. "That's it? Okay?" "That's it." Lena stared at her for a moment. "Do you ever actually feel things, or is it like a rumor you've heard about feelings?" Claire almost smiled. Almost. "Go check the patient in Bay 2. His last potassium was low." She waited until Lena had gone. Then she looked at the corner of the workstation, at the surface below the desk where she kept, in the pocket of her bag, a folded photograph, small, weathered, edges soft from handling, that she had carried through 2 deployments, 1 collapse, and 17 years of a life she had built from the remains of the one she used to have. She didn't take it out. She didn't need to. She just knew it was there, and that was enough. And she went back to the chart, and the monitors beeped their steady rhythms, and at the far end of the floor, past the doors to the family waiting room, Derek Voss sat with his jacket in his hands and said something to his sister that Claire could not hear. And outside the hospital windows, the Colorado dark pressed flat and cold against the glass. And somewhere in that building, a formal complaint was already moving through the administrative system, with her name on it, and she knew it, and she opened the next chart anyway. The overnight shift at Harlow Medical Center had 11 hours left. She had been in worse situations with less time. The complaint cleared administrative intake at 2:47 a.m. Claire knew this because Nancy told her at 3:04, stopping by the workstation with the expression of someone delivering bad news they'd been sitting with long enough that the delivery had become its own kind of burden. Nancy was 56, had been a nurse for 28 years before moving into supervision, and she had the particular competence of people who had earned every position they'd ever held and resented, quietly but permanently, the ones who hadn't. "It's formal," Nancy said. He used the word negligent. Claire looked up from the chart. "In what context?" "Delayed recognition of the tamponade." The thing about that, the specific thing, the one Claire turned over once and set aside, was that it was technically arguable. If you read the chart in a particular way, if you started from the endpoint and worked backward and decided to ignore the timestamps on her flags and Halverson's response times, you could construct a narrative where the recognition had been slow. You could. It required a deliberate misreading, but it was possible. People had built careers on deliberate misreadings. "Okay," Claire said. Nancy looked at her. "He's also requesting a formal review of the case. He knows someone on the hospital board." "Who?" "Alderman Briggs. His wife is on the board of directors. Voss's uncle was her father's." Nancy made a gesture that meant the connections are long and uninteresting, and ultimately the point is that they exist. The point is there are connections. Claire nodded once and went back to the chart. "Claire, I heard you, Nancy. I need you to understand that this could..." "I flagged the tamponade at 11:52. Halverson confirmed at 12:08. The procedure started at 12:19. The general's pressure was stable at 12:41. She said it without heat, without performance, just the numbers in the order they happened. If someone wants to review the case is reviewable." Nancy held her gaze for a moment. "You should call your union rep." "In the morning. Now, Claire. She stopped. She looked at Nancy properly, the way you look at someone when you want them to know you've actually heard them. I'll call it 6 when she's awake. The review won't start before morning anyway. What I need to do right now is finish monitoring Bay 6 and check the new admission in Bay 9. Nancy left. The floor kept its overnight frequency. Monitors, ventilators, the muted rubber sole rhythm of nurses who had learned over years to move at the exact volume required, present enough to be immediate, quiet enough not to add to the weight of rooms where people were already carrying too much. Claire moved through the next 2 hours with the mechanical steadiness of someone who had learned a long time ago to separate the professional from everything else without pretending the separation was clean or permanent. It wasn't. The complaint was there. She could feel it the way you feel a bruise, not debilitating, just present, a reminder that something had made contact. The general was stable. That was the thing she came back to. Not as comfort, exactly, more as anchor. Whatever happened with the complaint, whatever Derek Voss had filed or was planning to file, his father's heart was beating at a reasonable rate, and his pressure was holding, and the fluid around his heart had been drained before it finished the job it had been starting. That was real. That was documented. That was the kind of thing that didn't change regardless of what paperwork was moving through the administrative system. She was in Bay 9. New admit, 63-year-old man, post-cardiac catheterization, monitoring for arrhythmia, when Marcus appeared in the doorway. "He's back on the floor," Marcus said, keeping his voice to a murmur. "Voss. He's at the desk. He's asking about the morning attending." "What about the morning attending?" "He wants a full case review with whoever takes over from Halverson at 7. He's put something in writing." Marcus paused. "He's also asking who flagged the tamponade, like, specifically, by name." Claire wrote the potassium number in her notation. "What did the desk say?" "Karen told him to come back after rounds." "Good." Claire. Marcus was young enough that his face still showed everything. Right now, it showed the particular anxiety of someone who had witnessed enough to know what the shape of a thing meant, but not enough to know how it usually ended. "He's got a folder." She looked up. "Like a printed folder," Marcus said, "with stuff in it." A folder meant someone had done preparation. Preparation meant this wasn't impulse, wasn't the grief-fueled complaint of a frightened son in the middle of the night. This had been assembled, which meant either Derek Voss was the kind of person who traveled with administrative ammunition, entirely possible, or someone else had helped him build the case, which was a different kind of problem. She finished Bay 9 and went back to the workstation and pulled up the incident reporting portal on the desktop. She filed her own account of the evening, timestamps, observations, clinical decisions, the sequence of flags and responses, in the careful, specific language of someone who had learned that documentation was not bureaucracy. It was survival. She wrote for 22 minutes without stopping. She did not editorialize. She did not explain herself. She stated what happened in the order it happened, and she cited the chart entries that corroborated each point. She submitted it at 4:38 a.m. Then she sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and looked at the ceiling, which was the drop tile variety, beige, unremarkable, and had no particular wisdom to offer. She thought about the folder. She thought about the morning attending, who was Dr. Renata Fowler, who was good at her job and also occasionally susceptible to the kind of administrative pressure that accumulated when board members' names were involved. She thought about a particular morning in a different country, in a different decade, when she had been the person in the folder, when someone had decided that what she had done was a problem and had assembled the paperwork to make that case and had been wrong about all of it and had ultimately been proven wrong, but not before 6 months of investigation and a review board, and her own silence had made the whole thing far worse than it needed to be. She had learned from that. What she had learned was not to be quieter. She pulled out her phone and sent a message to her union rep at 4:41 a.m. that said, "Need to talk before your first meeting. Not urgent, but time-sensitive. I'll explain." Then she put the phone in her pocket and went back to work. The shift change happened at 7:15 with the usual overlap. Outgoing nurses finishing documentation while incoming nurses reviewed charts. The information moving person to person in the organic and slightly chaotic transfer that every hospital managed differently and every experienced nurse navigated by instinct. Claire gave her briefing on Bay 6 to the day shift nurse, a quiet Guatemalan woman named Petra, who had been in the ICU for 9 years and asked exactly the right questions in the right order. which Claire had always considered the highest possible professional compliment. She was finishing her last note when she saw Derek Voss in the hallway outside the ICU. He was talking to Dr. Fowler. Fowler was the kind of physician who wore her competence on a delay, not because she was slow, but because she was careful, the kind of careful that meant she didn't commit to a position until she understood all the angles. She was listening to Voss with the attentiveness of someone who was also, simultaneously, evaluating. Claire could see it from 30 feet away, the slight angling of Fowler's body that said, "I am taking this seriously without committing to, I agree with you." The folder was open. Voss was pointing at something in it. Claire watched for a moment from the workstation doorway. She was aware of a sensation she had learned to identify accurately over years. Not quite anger, not quite fear, something that lived between them. The particular internal weather of a person who can see a thing moving toward them and cannot stop it and has to decide what to do with that knowledge. She picked up her bag. She completed her sign-off. She clocked out at 7:31. She did not go home. She went to the hospital cafeteria, which was nearly empty at this hour, and she bought bad coffee and a granola bar, and she sat in the corner and called her union rep, whose name was Diane, who answered on the second ring. "Tell me," Diane said. So Claire told her. All of it. The timestamps, the flags, the procedure, the complaint, the folder, the board connection. She told it the way she'd written the incident report. No editorializing, no emotion, just the sequence. Diane listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Claire had always liked about her. "The board connection is the one I'd watch," Diane said when Claire finished. "Everything else, the clinical record is clear. Flagged early, responded fast, outcome was good. That's not a negligence case that goes anywhere. But if someone with board access decides to push for a review panel and the framing is already set before the panel convenes, that's where things get complicated." How complicated? Depends on Fowler and on who sits on the panel. Fowler's solid. Fowler is solid, Diane agreed, with the specific tone that meant and also human and also susceptible to things that are not purely clinical. "I'll make some calls. Don't say anything to administration that isn't in writing. If they ask you for a meeting, I'm in the room." Claire agreed. She drank her terrible coffee. The cafeteria filled gradually with the morning shift. Orderlies, visitors, nurses coming off nights, who had the particular hollowed-out look of people who had been awake when the world was asleep, and were now watching the world wake up around them with a mild, persistent bewilderment. She was almost finished when someone sat down across from her. She looked up. It was Derek Voss, out of uniform now. Civilian clothes, dark jacket, jeans that looked pressed, which was the kind of detail that told you something about a person. His face was different in the morning light, still controlled, but there was something behind the control that hadn't been there at midnight, a specific kind of tired that wasn't about sleep. "I saw you on my way in," he said, which explained nothing about why he'd sat down. Claire looked at him and waited. "My father is doing better," he said. "They told me at morning rounds." "I know, Petra's briefed." He looked at the table, at the coffee in front of her, at something in the middle distance that wasn't in the cafeteria. "I filed a complaint last night," he said. "I know that too. I want to—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not withdrawing it." She looked at him. "Okay, but I want to say that I understand the outcome was—" He seemed to be working through language like it was physically difficult. "That the procedure was done correctly, that my father is alive." "He is." "I still have concerns about the timing of the—" "Then the review process is the appropriate place for those concerns," she said. "That's what it exists for." He looked at her directly for the first time since he'd sat down. His eyes were the same light gray as his uniform had been, which was the kind of coincidence that meant nothing but registered anyway. "You're not going to argue with me," he said. "It wasn't really a question." "No." "Most people would." "I'm not most people." Something moved across his face. Not quite recognition, more like the preliminary sensation of recognition, the awareness that something is familiar before you've identified what. "Where did you work before Harlow?" he asked. It was a different question than he'd asked at midnight, more specific, less hostile and more curious in a way that felt like it had been building since before he sat down. "Various places," she said. "That's not an answer." It's the one I have. He watched her for a moment. She drank her coffee. Outside the cafeteria windows, the Colorado morning was doing what Colorado mornings did in late autumn. Clear and cold and aggressively bright, the kind of light that made everything look more definitive than it was. You said last night you'd been in worse situations, he said, than the Bay. I said I'd been calm in worse situations. Same thing. It's not, actually. He leaned back slightly. Not retreat, reassessment. I've been in some bad situations myself, he said, and she heard in it the thing people heard in military men when they said things like that. The shorthand for, I've seen things that changed me and I don't talk about it, but I want you to know it's there. She recognized the shorthand. She used it herself. She was about to say something carefully neutral and end the conversation when his phone rang. He looked at it, then looked at her, then answered it. A brief clipped exchange that ended with, yes, sir, understood, I'll be there at 9, and stood. Duty calls, she said, not unkindly. He put the phone in his pocket. He stood there for a moment in the way of someone who has more to say and has not yet decided whether to say it. The complaint stands, he said. I want to be clear. You've been clear. He nodded, turned to go, then stopped. Dempsey, he said. Just the name. Like he was confirming it. That's me, she said. He left. She sat with her empty coffee cup for a while and thought about his face when he said her name. The specific quality of the pause before it. The way his thumb had been pressing against the side of his phone. Not a nervous habit exactly. More like the unconscious anchoring movement of someone whose mind was running harder than their face showed. She had seen that gesture before. She sat with that thought for a while and then set it aside, because whatever it wasn't useful yet, and she had other things to deal with, and the morning was already running. The call from hospital administration came at 9:45. Diane was in the room by 10:10. The meeting was in the office of the VP of Medical Operations, a man named Gareth Lundholm, who was 50, professionally pleasant, and had the specific quality of someone who had learned to manage difficult situations by ensuring that difficult situations never quite resolved, by keeping them in a state of managed uncertainty that protected everyone on the administrative side regardless of what happened to anyone else. He told Claire that the complaint had been received and logged, that a case review had been initiated, that the review panel would convene within 72 hours, and that in the interim, she was being reassigned from the ICU to a float position covering general medical floors. Diane said, On what grounds? Lundholm said, Standard procedure during a formal complaint review. No finding has been made. It's a de facto suspension, Diane said, without cause and before any review finding. It's a precautionary reassignment. Ms. Dempsey's pay and benefits are unaffected. Claire looked at the window behind Lundholm's head, which faced a parking structure which offered a view of concrete and a thin strip of sky. Who's on the panel? Diane asked. The panel composition will be communicated once finalized. And the timeline for the review? 72 hours for the initial panel convening. The review itself may take 1 to 2 weeks. 1 to 2 weeks on the general medicine floors. 1 to 2 weeks while a panel assembled around a complaint filed at 2:47 a.m. by a man who had a folder and a connection to a board member, reviewing a case in which a patient was alive and documented as stable, in which every clinical decision was time-stamped and defensible, in which the outcome was by any reasonable measure good. This was going to be 1 to 2 weeks of that, because Derek Voss knew someone and had a folder and had used the word negligent at 3 in the morning. She felt it then, properly felt it. The thing she'd been holding at arm's length since Nancy told her about the complaint. It moved through her chest like pressure, not pain, something slower and larger than pain. She had earned every hour of the 17 years that had led to the decision she made at 11:52 p.m. She had earned it in ways that didn't appear on her nursing license and weren't captured in her personnel file, and that she had never told anyone at Harlow Medical Center because they were not things you explained in job interviews or break room conversations. And she was being moved to the general medicine floors because a man in a press jacket was angry about a night that had ended with his father's heart beating correctly. She looked away from the parking structure. I'll comply with the reassignment, she said. Effective when? Immediately, Lundholm said. End of today's shift. She nodded. Diane walked out with her and kept her mouth shut until they were in the hallway, which was one of the many things Claire appreciated about Diane. This is retaliatory, Diane said then. Not legally, on the paperwork, but in practice. He moved fast. Board connection, like you said. Can we challenge the reassignment? We can. It slows things down and it draws more attention to you, which may or may not be what you want. What I want, Claire said, and stopped. Because what she wanted was to go back upstairs and check on the general and finish the week she'd been scheduled to work, and that was not what was on offer. Let me think, Diane said. Don't do anything today. Don't send emails. If Fowler approaches you, tell her you're happy to answer questions through the review process. And if Voss approaches me again? Diane looked at her. He approached you? Cafeteria, this morning. What did he say? That the complaint stands. Diane processed this. What did you say? That the review process is the appropriate place for his concerns. Diane almost smiled. Good. She paused. You know something about him. I can tell. Claire started walking. I know that he's filing a complaint that isn't going to hold up. That's not what I mean. I know. She spent the rest of the morning in the float pool assignments coordinator's office learning her temporary placement, East Wing, General Medical, beds 20 through 36. And then she went up to the floor and did the job. Because the job was the job regardless of which floor you did it on, and patients on the East Wing General Medical floor were still patients, still sick, still needed someone paying attention. She worked through the afternoon. She was checking a medication reconciliation at 2:30 when her phone vibrated with a text from a number she didn't recognize. She looked at it in a quiet moment at the medication station, her back to the hallway. The text said, This is Petra. From Bay 6, you need to know something. Call me when you're clear. She called at 3:15 in the stairwell between floors, where the acoustics made everything sound like it was happening at a slight remove. Voss went back into Bay 6 this morning, Petra said, keeping her voice low. During rounds, he was fine. He was with his father, normal family visit. But then Dr. Fowler came through and he asked her, in front of me, in front of the general, about the standard of care timeline, like he was testing her, like he'd rehearsed it. What did Fowler say? She said the clinical record would be reviewed through the proper channels. Petra paused. But then afterward, in the hallway, I heard her on the phone. I wasn't trying to listen. She said, and I'm pretty sure she didn't know I was there. She said, yes, I've seen the record. I understand the concern. I'll make sure the panel has the full picture. Claire was quiet. The thing is, Petra said, I don't know what that means. It might mean she's being fair, but it also might mean that she's already framing it. Yeah. Claire leaned against the stairwell wall. The fluorescent light above her had a faint flicker that she hadn't noticed when she came in, but now couldn't stop noticing. Thank you, she said. Claire. Petra hesitated. He asked about you this morning. Voss. He asked one of the other nurses how long you'd been at Harlow. What did they tell him? 3 years? That's right. He asked where you were before. What did they tell him? They didn't know. Nobody here really knows, do they? It wasn't quite a question. No, Claire said. They don't. She ended the call and stood in the stairwell and thought about Derek Voss asking where she'd been before. About the thumb on the side of the phone. About the way he'd said her name, Dempsey, in the cafeteria, with that specific pause before it. She thought about the thumb again. There was something there. She couldn't locate it yet. It was the same sensation as knowing you've forgotten a word. You can feel the shape of it, feel the weight of the space it should occupy, without being able to retrieve it. She went back to the floor. The afternoon finished and the early evening shift began to overlap, and she was completing her last medication check of the day when Lena appeared. Not at Harlow. The East Wing wasn't Lena's floor, which meant Lena had come specifically to find her. What happened? Claire asked. I need to tell you something, Lena said, and I need you to not react. I don't react. I know. That's why I said it. Lena glanced down the hallway and then back. So you know how Voss has been asking about you, about your background? Yes. I think he found something. She said it carefully, watching Claire's face. He was at the nursing station this afternoon, the ICU station, and he had his phone out and he was looking at something. I walked past and I didn't mean to look, but She stopped. It looked like a military personnel search, one of those veteran registry databases, like the ones families use to find records. Claire felt the stairwell feeling again, minus the stairwell. What did he see? She asked. I don't know. The screen changed when I walked by, but Claire... Lena hesitated one more time, which was unusual for Lena. He was smiling. The kind of smile that meant something had landed, that a puzzle piece had clicked into a space. Thank you, Claire said. What does it mean? What would he find? I don't know yet, Claire said, which was partly true and partly the kind of thing you said when the full truth was going to take longer than a hallway conversation to explain. She drove home at 7 o'clock and made food she didn't taste and sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and did something she almost never did, which was search herself. Not the public nursing registry, but she'd checked that before taking the Harlow position. The veteran databases, the ones families used, the ones that aggregated partial records from DoD, from VA enrollment, from military newspaper archives, from the public portions of unit histories. Most of her record was clean in the sense of absent. The operational details, the deployments, the classified assignments, those didn't surface on any civilian database. What surfaced was minimal: her rank at separation, her branch, her years of service. No awards, no unit designations, no incident records. But there was one thing. One database, a veteran advocacy nonprofit that had published a compilation of combat medic recognition stories in 2019, had included in a footnote that she had not known existed and had not consented to 3 sentences. About a field hospital, about a specific incident, about a master sergeant in the Army Medical Service Corps who had performed battlefield triage in a collapsed structure while under fire, and had been awarded a commendation that the article noted was not reflected in any public record due to classification. Yo Buwaspam. It didn't include her name. It included her former unit designation and her year, and it said Master Sergeant, and it said not reflected in any public record. If you knew enough to search the right combination of terms, if you had a year and a branch and a rank, if you were motivated and systematic and happened to have access to the kind of military network that a Navy commander of 15 years service would absolutely have access to, you might find those 3 sentences. And if you found them, and you remembered that the nurse who had been at your father's bedside was calm in a way that didn't fit a civilian floor, and you'd asked her where she'd worked before, and she'd said somewhere that's not on my resume. She closed the laptop. She sat for a moment in the kitchen that was quiet except for the refrigerator hum. She was not afraid of Derek Voss knowing who she was. She had never been afraid of that. What she was something harder to name. The particular alertness of someone who has built a careful, deliberate distance from a former life, and who can feel that distance narrowing, not because they did anything wrong, but because someone else has decided to look. She had built this life on purpose, not to hide, to choose. There was a difference. Her phone vibrated on the table. Unknown number. She looked at it, let it ring once, twice, answered. Silence on the other end, then, Ms. Dempsey. Not a question. The voice was male, controlled, with the specific cadence of someone accustomed to being direct. Not Voss. Who is this? She asked. My name is Colonel Alan Marsh. I'm with the Army Medical Service Corps, currently attached to Fort Carson. A pause. I was given this number by someone who was recently looking at your service record. She sat very still. You have my attention, she said. Good. Another pause, and in it something careful and deliberate. Because what Commander Voss found this afternoon when he was searching your background is a great deal less than what other people are about to find. And some of those people are not going to be happy about what they see. The refrigerator hummed, the Colorado dark pressed against the kitchen window. Claire's hand was steady on the phone, but something behind her sternum had gone very quiet and very alert. What people? She said. That, Colonel Marsh said, is what I need to talk to you about in person. She met him the next morning. Not at the hospital. Marsh had been specific about that. Not the hospital, not anywhere connected to Harlow or the complaint or Derek Voss's orbit. He'd named a diner on Cascade Avenue, the kind of place that had been the same diner for 30 years and would be the same diner for 30 more, the kind where the booths were deep and the coffee came without being asked, and the morning crowd was loud enough to cover a conversation without trying. Claire arrived 8 minutes early. Habit. She took a booth in the back corner with sight lines to both the entrance and the kitchen hallway. Also habit. Marsh arrived at exactly the time he'd said he would, which told her something. He was mid-50s, compact, the kind of build that had once been harder and hadn't gone entirely soft. He wore civilian clothes, dark slacks, a gray jacket, but he moved in uniform. You couldn't entirely train that out of a person. She recognized it because she still did it herself and had mostly stopped noticing. He sat down across from her without preamble, and the waitress appeared and he ordered black coffee, and Claire refilled hers and they waited until the waitress was gone. "You look different," he said, "from the file photos." 17 years, she said. "Still?" He looked at her in the assessing way of someone calibrating how much of what they planned to say was going to land. "You've been at Harlow 3 years." "That's right. Before that, the travel nursing program. Before that, the VA clinic in Pueblo. Before that, Walter Reed Transition Ward." He said it matter-of-factly, not as a recitation of surveillance, but as confirmation that he'd done his reading. "You built a very clean civilian record." "I tried." "You succeeded." He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug, "which makes what's happening right now somewhat inconvenient." She waited. "There's an investigation," Marsh said, "not about you, adjacent to you." He paused, choosing the next words with the care of someone navigating a minefield they'd partially mapped. "It concerns a lieutenant colonel named Harding, Owen Harding. You know that name." She did. She kept her face where it was. "Harding was your commanding officer for approximately 14 months, Marsh continued, during which time he made several administrative decisions regarding personnel records that are now under review by the Army Inspector General's office. Specifically, decisions that affected how certain commendations were documented, or not documented, for soldiers under his command." Claire set her coffee down. "He buried records. The IG's language is more measured than that, but yes. Several soldiers who performed documented acts of valor during the relevant operational period have incomplete or inaccurate records as a result. Commendations that were approved at higher levels and never properly entered. Performance evaluations that were altered." He met her eyes. "Yours is one of them." The diner moved around them. A man 2 booths over was reading a newspaper. The waitress was refilling something at the counter. Outside the window, Cascade Avenue was doing its morning thing. Traffic, pedestrians, a delivery truck double parked. "What does this have to do with Derek Voss?" she asked. Marsh turned his mug slightly on the table. "Commander Voss's search of veteran databases yesterday, the one your colleague observed, triggered an alert in a monitoring system the IG's office set up 6 weeks ago. Any search that touches the relevant unit designation from that operational period gets flagged. They've been tracking who's looking at what, trying to establish whether Harding had ongoing relationships with people who might have been managing information. Voss isn't connected to Harding. No. His search was coincidental." Marsh said it plainly. "But the flag brought your name into active circulation within the investigation. People who didn't know you were at Harlow Medical Center now know you're at Harlow Medical Center. And people who've been reviewing what Harding did to your record are—" He paused again. "Motivated." She absorbed this. Outside, the delivery truck was pulling away. "What does motivated mean?" "It means the IG's office wants to speak with you, formally, as a witness with first-hand knowledge of the operational period." He looked at her steadily. "It also means that when they come, they're going to be bringing documentation. Corrected documentation. The commendations that Harding suppressed are being formally reinstated to the record, including yours." She sat with that for a moment. 17 years. The Bronze Star had been approved. She had known it was approved, had been told by the brigade commander himself, in a tent, in language that was warm and specific and completely unofficial. And then Harding had done whatever Harding had done, and the paper trail had gone quiet, and she had eventually stopped waiting for it to materialize and had built her civilian life around the fact that it wasn't going to. "When?" she asked. "The IG team is scheduled to be in Colorado Springs Thursday." He watched her. "That's tomorrow." She picked up her coffee. It was getting cold. "There's a complication," she said. It wasn't a question. "The complaint at Harlow, the review panel." He nodded. "Yes, the IG's office is aware of it. They're not going to intervene. That's outside their jurisdiction, but the timing is a problem." "It's awkward," he said. "The panel convenes tomorrow morning. The IG team arrives tomorrow afternoon." If Harlow's administration knows that a federal investigation team is arriving in relation to one of their nurses and they don't understand the context, they'll assume the worst. They'll assume the most concerning thing, he said, because that's what administrators do with incomplete information. She thought about Lundholm, about Fowler on the phone, about the folder. Can the IG team brief hospital administration before the panel convenes? She asked. That would require your authorization. You'd have to consent to the IG disclosing the nature of the investigation to Harlow's legal counsel. He paused. Which would also mean your record, the corrected record, would become visible to hospital administration, including the commendations. She looked at the window, at Cascade Avenue. She had not wanted this. The corrected record, the commendations, the public acknowledgement of a life she had chosen to put behind a closed door. She had not wanted any of it resurrected and laid out in a hospital administrator's office for people who hadn't earned the context to understand it. But the alternative was walking into a review panel tomorrow morning with an incomplete record and a board-connected complaint, and Fowler already framing the case. Do it, she said. Authorize the briefing. Marsh reached into his jacket and produced a single folded sheet. I had a feeling, he said. Sign here. She signed. She drove back to her apartment and sat at her kitchen table for a long time without turning any lights on, which wasn't dramatic. The sun was fully up, the room was bright. It was just that she didn't need more light than was already coming in, and sometimes not adding anything was its own kind of decision. She thought about Harding. She had not hated him. That was the part people expected when pieces of this story emerged. They expected her to have a clear villain she'd spent years building a narrative around. But the truth was more banal and more corrosive than hatred. Harding had been a bureaucrat with authority over paperwork during a period when she had been focused on not dying. She hadn't known what he'd done until 2 years after separation, when a former colleague had mentioned, offhandedly, that he'd heard Harding had been managing outcomes for several personnel under his command. And by then, she had already built enough of the civilian life that going back to fight for the paperwork had seemed like the wrong trade. She had been wrong about that. She called Diane at 9:30. I need to update you, she said. I'm listening. She told her. All of it this time. Not just the current complaint, but the background, the operational period, Harding, the IG investigation, Marsh, the authorization she'd signed that morning. Diane was quiet through most of it with the focused quiet of someone processing at speed. Okay, Diane said when she finished. This changes things considerably. I know. The panel convenes at 9 tomorrow. If Harlow Legal gets the IG briefing today, Lundholm will want to delay the panel. Yes. Which might actually be in your favor, or might mean the whole thing drags out longer. Depends on how Harlow's counsel reads the situation. She paused. Claire, the commendations. The Bronze Star. If that's coming into the record publicly, it's going to complicate things. It's going to change the entire shape of the complaint, Diane said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite satisfaction. Something more measured, more careful, like someone who had been in enough of these situations to know that good news in one direction often meant complexity somewhere else. A nurse with that background, with that clinical record, with a federal investigation confirming that her personnel file was deliberately suppressed, the complaint doesn't hold. But Lundholm is still going to have to manage the board relationship. Voss's connection to the board. Yes, and that's a politics problem, not a clinical one. Diane paused again. How are you holding up? I'm fine. That's a reflex, not an answer. Claire looked at the kitchen window, at the Cascade Avenue light coming in at an angle. I built this life so I wouldn't have to have this conversation, she said. That's how I'm holding up. Diane was quiet for a moment in a way that said she understood and wasn't going to make it worse by commenting. Let me talk to our attorney, she said. I'll call you by noon. The call came at 11:47. Panels postponed, Diane said. 24 hours. Lundholm received the IG briefing an hour ago and immediately convened an emergency meeting with Harlow's legal counsel and the board liaison. It's a pause. The board liaison is not Alderman Briggs's wife. Turns out there are 2 board members with Voss family connections, and the one Lundholm called is the other one. Someone who appears to be significantly less interested in protecting Derek Voss's complaint and significantly more interested in protecting Harlow Medical Center from what it would mean to have sustained a retaliatory reassignment against a federally decorated veteran. That's a lot of interest management. Hospitals run on liability calculations, Diane said. The calculation just changed. Claire stood at her kitchen counter and processed this. It should have felt like relief. It did, partly. But relief was never clean when it came with this much drag attached. That afternoon, she went for a run. Not because she was a person who processed things by running, she wasn't particularly, but because the apartment was starting to feel like a space where she was waiting for the next thing to happen, and waiting passively was something she had always been genuinely bad at. She ran the Garden of the Gods trail, which was too crowded at this time of day, but had the advantage of being physically demanding enough that her brain partially disengaged from the administrative tangle and focused on the actual problem of not twisting an ankle on red sandstone. She ran harder than she meant to. Her lungs complained. She kept running. She was 2 miles out when her phone buzzed in her armband. She stopped. Unknown number. Different unknown than Marcia's. She answered, "Dempsey." "Ms. Dempsey." A woman's voice. Precise, efficient, the vocal equivalent of a well-organized desk. "This is Special Agent Renata Okafor, Army Inspector General's office. Colonel Marsh indicated you'd been briefed on our timeline." "He did. I'm reaching out because our schedule has accelerated. We'll be at Fort Carson tonight rather than tomorrow afternoon. I'd like to meet with you this evening if you're available." "Tonight. I understand it's short notice. Given the panel convening tomorrow morning, even in postponed form, I'd prefer you to have full information before you walk into that room." She looked at the red rock formations in front of her, at the afternoon light hitting them in a way that made them look like something that had been painted rather than eroded. "What time?" 6 o'clock. Fort Carson, Building 104. "Oh, I'll leave your name at the gate." She agreed and ended the call and ran the 2 miles back faster than she'd run the first 2. She showered. She changed into the clothes she wore when she needed people to take her seriously. Not a performance, just the pragmatic understanding that presentation was information and she wanted to control what information she was offering. Dark slacks, a charcoal blazer, her hair down, but not elaborately so. She looked in the mirror once and saw herself accurately, which was all she ever asked of mirrors. Fort Carson's Building 1040 was an administrative structure, beige and functional, located in the part of the post that civilian contractors and attached personnel used. The MP at the gate had her name. She was directed to a conference room on the second floor where Special Agent Okafor was already set up. A woman in her early 40s, precise dark suit, a laptop open, and 2 folders on the table in front of her. A second person was present, a younger man introduced as Special Agent Tron, who had a legal pad and the careful listening posture of someone whose job in this meeting was to hear everything and say very little. "Thank you for coming on short notice," Okafor said. "Thank you for the context on timing," Claire said. They sat. Okafor opened the first folder. What followed was 2 hours of conversation that was a careful distance from comfortable. Okafor was thorough and undramatic, the kind of investigator who asked questions you had already answered and asked them again differently to check whether the answer changed. Claire had been in enough formal questioning situations to recognize the technique and to understand that the right response to it was not resentment, but consistency, because consistency was what the technique was testing for. She was consistent. She told them about the operational period, about Harding, not speculation, not inference, what she had directly observed and experienced, about the commendation process she'd been told had been initiated and the silence that had followed, about her separation, about her choice to build the civilian life she'd built. She did not editorialize. She did not perform emotion. She answered what was asked, and when she didn't know something, she said she didn't know, which in her experience was the most useful thing a witness could do. At the 90-minute mark, Okafor opened the second folder. "I want to show you something," she said, and slid a document across the table. Claire looked at it. It was her personnel record. Or rather, it was what her personnel record should have looked like. The corrected version, as Marsh had described. The entries Harding had suppressed were now present. The Bronze Star with Valor device, the commendation from the brigade commander, 2 additional meritorious service notations that she hadn't known had been approved. Her final rank. The deployment notations. It was her. It was her actual record. And looking at it was a stranger sensation than she'd expected. Not pride, not vindication, something quieter and more complicated than either, like looking at a photograph of yourself at an age you didn't remember clearly. "This has been formally submitted to the official record," Okafor said, "as of this morning." "Okay," Claire said. Okafor watched her. "Most people have more of a reaction." "I'm having a reaction," Claire said. "I'm just not performing it." Something shifted in Okafor's expression. Not quite a smile, the precursor to one. "Fair enough." She retrieved the document. "One more question, and then I'll let you go." She paused. "Commander Derek Voss. His search of veteran databases triggered our monitoring flag. Do you have any prior relationship with him?" "No." "You're certain?" "I'm certain." Okafor nodded slowly. Looked at something in the folder. His father, General Raymond Voss, retired. Prior service, Army, separated 2008. Claire stilled. "General Voss," Okafor continued, "was the deputy brigade commander during the relevant operational period. He would have been in your chain of command." She sat with that. The general. The man she had been watching all night, whose heart she had flagged, and whose chest she had been ready to drain. The man who had said gave you trouble with the resigned familiarity of someone describing a pattern. The man she had kept alive. Was Derek Voss's father, was also her former deputy brigade commander. "I didn't know," she said, and it was the complete truth. "His records indicate he was transferred out of the unit 2 months before the incident that generated your commendation," Okafor said. "So he wouldn't have been present for it, but he would have been aware of personnel in the unit." She paused. "He may have recognized your name when his son filed the complaint." Claire thought about the general's eyes opening, about the thing on his face when she'd said his son was in the waiting room. The expression she hadn't been able to read had filed as complicated and moved past. It hadn't been complicated. It had been specific. He had known exactly who was watching him. She drove home in the dark and ate something and did not sleep well, which was honest. And at 6:15 a.m. she was dressed. And at 7:30 she was in the Harlow Medical Center parking structure, sitting in her car, doing the things she did before situations that required her full presence. Not meditation, not ritual, just stillness. The deliberate practice of being entirely in the moment before the moment required her. The panel convened at 9. Lundholm's conference room, which she had been in 2 days ago for a different, uncomfortable reason, had been rearranged. A longer table, more chairs. The panel consisted of Fowler, who was the clinical representative, a hospital attorney named Garrison, who was 40 and sharp-suited and had the quality of someone who had read everything available before entering the room. The board liaison Claire didn't know by sight, and a fourth person she identified from the name placard as Dr. Jerome Ashby, the chief of medical staff. Ashby's presence changed things. He didn't attend routine complaint reviews. His being here meant this had moved up the significance ladder. Derek Voss was not in the room. Complainants didn't sit on review panels. He was somewhere in the building. She was aware of that the way you're aware of weather systems. Diane was beside her. Garrison opened. He outlined the complaint, the timeline, the clinical record. He was neutral in tone and thorough in coverage, which told her that Harlow's counsel had already done the liability math and was managing toward a specific outcome. She listened without showing that she was reading the room. Fowler spoke next. To her credit, and Claire's reading of her had always been that she was fundamentally honest even when susceptible to pressure. Fowler presented the clinical record accurately. The timestamps, the flags, the procedure. She did not editorialize toward the complaint or away from it. She stated the facts. Ashby asked 2 questions. Both were clinical, both were the right questions, which told her he'd read the chart himself and not just the summary. Then Garrison set a folder on the table and said, "There is additional context that has come to the panel's attention that is relevant to this review. I want to ensure the panel has the complete picture before any assessment is made." He opened it. He described the IG investigation, the suppressed record, the reinstatement of commendations. He did not overdramatize it, to his credit, but he also did not understate it. He laid out what Claire's complete military record indicated: the years of service, the operational deployments, the combat medicine specialization, the commendations including the Bronze Star, The role as a combat rescue instructor in special operations environments. The room was quiet when he finished. The board liaison, a woman in her 60s named Margaret Hartley, who had the quality of someone who had been managing powerful people for long enough that their power no longer particularly impressed her, looked at Claire for the first time since the session had started. "Ms. Dempsey," she said, "in your assessment, your clinical assessment, was the timing of the tamponade recognition within the standard of care?" "Yes," Claire said, "and the outcome?" "The patient is stable." Hartley looked at the folder in front of her. "The complaint alleges negligent delay." "The complaint is incorrect," Claire said. "Not heated, not defensive, just accurate." Ashby looked at Fowler. Something passed between them that was clinical shorthand, the kind that didn't require words. "Dr. Fowler," Ashby said, "your assessment." Fowler looked at the table for a moment before she answered, and Claire recognized that moment. The moment between knowing what's right and saying it when saying it is going to create friction. "The record supports Ms. Dempsey's account entirely," Fowler said. "The early flag at 11:52, the attending response time, the procedure timing. There is no finding of negligence supportable by this chart." The room absorbed that. And then, before Garrison could move to the next procedural step, the conference room door opened. Not dramatically, just opened. A knock that came simultaneously with the opening, the kind people do when they're already moving. It was Lundholm's assistant, a young man named Kieran, who was usually unflappable and was currently not. He said something to Lundholm in a low voice. Lundholm's expression changed. "Excuse me," Lundholm said, and went to the door. The conversation in the doorway was quiet enough that only fragments reached her. Waiting room. He came in, asking to address the panel, and then one phrase, clear, "General Voss." Fowler looked at Claire. Claire looked at the door. Lundholm came back to the table. He had the expression of a man who had expected to manage one situation and was now managing a different one and was recalibrating in real time. "It appears," he said, "that General Raymond Voss has arrived at the hospital and is requesting to speak to this panel." Silence. "He left the ICU this morning," Fowler said with the voice of someone who had just checked the data in her head and found it alarming. "He was approved for step-down, not discharge. He's not—" "He discharged himself," Kieran said from the doorway. "A MA against medical advice. About 40 minutes ago." Hartley said, "Can he physically—" "He's ambulatory," Kieran said. "He's in a wheelchair, but he came in under his own direction. He has—" A pause. "He has documents with him." Diane's hand touched Claire's arm briefly, just briefly, not comfort, just acknowledgement. The door opened wider. Raymond Voss was 71 years old and had been in cardiac tamponade 60 hours ago, and he came into the conference room in a hospital-issue wheelchair, pushed by a young orderly who looked like he was not entirely sure how he'd gotten involved in this. And he was wearing civilian clothes that someone had clearly brought him, and he had a manila folder in his lap, and he had the bearing of a man who had spent 40 years being the most consequential person in every room he entered and had not entirely stopped being that person just because his heart had recently tried to kill him. He looked at the panel. He looked at Claire. "I'll be brief," he said. His voice was rougher than it had been 2 nights ago in the dim of Bay 6, but it was there, and it was steady. "I know who this nurse is. I knew before my son filed his complaint, and I have something this panel needs to see before it makes any decision." He opened the folder in his lap. He had printed materials in it. She could see the edges, the official letterhead, and something else. A photograph, worn at the edges, the kind you kept because you couldn't throw it away, even when you'd stopped looking at it regularly. He held it up. It was a unit photograph, the kind taken at the end of a deployment, the whole company lined up in the particular flat light of a forward operating base. She was in it, younger, harder looking, standing in the second row with her medic bag over one shoulder. Raymond Voss tapped the photograph once. "I knew her name the moment my son told me who was watching me that night," the general said. "I know exactly what she's capable of, and I know exactly what was done to her record." He looked at Lundholm. "And I'm going to tell this panel everything, whether my son likes it or not." The room was absolutely still. In the silence, the door opened a second time. Derek Voss stood in the frame. He was looking at his father, then at Claire, then at the photograph in his father's lap. And something was happening on his face that had no precedent in anything Claire had seen from him in the last 48 hours. Not anger, not calculation. Something that looked, from this angle, like the specific expression of a person who has just understood something they should have understood much earlier, and who is now reckoning with what that means. He looked at Claire. "You trained soldiers," he said. Quiet. Like he was saying it to himself as much as to her. She met his eyes and said nothing. "You trained soldiers at Kilo Base," he said. 2008, the winter deployment. The room had stopped breathing, because she had. She had been there, and the winter deployment at Kilo Base was not a thing that people in this conference room should know about, and the fact that Derek Voss knew the name of it meant he had found more than a footnote in a non-profit database. "Your thumb," she said, because it had arrived, finally, the thing she hadn't been able to retrieve. The thumb pressing against the side of his phone. The same gesture she had seen from a frightened 26-year-old lieutenant in a freezing training scenario, pressing his thumb against the side of his radio because he was scared and didn't want anyone to see it. "You were in my training cohort." He stared at her. "Lieutenant Voss," she said, the name she would have used then, the rank he'd held before everything else. "Kilo Base, November 2008. His face confirmed it before he said anything. And then, behind him, in the hallway, she heard other footsteps, multiple, organized, purposeful. And Colonel Marsh appeared in the doorway behind Derek Voss, in full uniform this time, and beside him 2 people she didn't recognize, but who had the quality of people who carried federal authority the way other people carried wallets. And one of them had a badge visible on their jacket. And Marsh looked at Claire with the particular expression of someone who had prepared for several contingencies, and was observing one of the more complicated ones unfold. "Ms. Dempsey," Marsh said, "the IG team would like to address this panel." Raymond Voss looked at his son in the doorway. Derek Voss looked at his father in the wheelchair. Claire looked at neither of them. She looked at the folder on the conference table, Garrison's folder, the one with her complete reinstated record, and she thought about the photograph in the general's lap and the footnote in a non-profit database. And a freezing November morning in 2008, when a young lieutenant had pressed his thumb against a radio and she had made a decision that had changed the outcome of a training exercise and had never told anyone the details of, and had then watched the paperwork for that decision disappear into Harding's bureaucratic machinery. She had been in worse situations. She had never been in one quite like this. The IG team entered the conference room in the way federal investigators entered rooms. Not dramatically, not loudly, but with the particular quality of gravity that came from people who carried paper that changed things. There were 3 of them besides Marsh. Okafor, whom Claire recognized from Fort Carson, a man in his 50s named Special Agent Dillard, who had the weathered patience of someone who had spent a career watching people make decisions under pressure, and a civilian attorney from the DoD General Counsel's office named Patricia Weil, who was 47 and carried a leather case that looked like it had been to more difficult rooms than this one. They arranged themselves along the wall rather than taking seats, which was a choice, and which meant they were observers first and participants second, at least for now. Lundholm looked at Garrison. Garrison looked at Okafor. "Special Agent Okafor," Garrison said carefully. "Can you characterize the nature of the IG's interest in this proceeding?" "The investigation is ongoing," Okafor said. "We're not here to interfere with Harlow's internal review process. We're here because relevant documentation has been formally corrected, and we want to ensure this panel has access to the complete record before any determination is made." She set a folder on the table, a 3rd folder, official, government stamped. "With the panel's permission," Hartley said. "Permitted." Lundholm glanced at Garrison, who gave a nearly invisible nod. The machinery of institutional self-preservation had already made its calculation, and the calculation was that accommodating federal investigators was significantly preferable to the alternative. Derek Voss was still in the doorway. He had not moved, not toward his father, not toward a seat, not toward the exit. He was doing the thing Claire had noticed he did when he was processing something that didn't fit his existing map of the situation. A specific stillness that wasn't calm, was more like a circuit temporarily overloaded, managing itself before attempting to restart. Raymond Voss, in his wheelchair, had not looked at his son since Derek appeared in the doorway. He was looking at the folder Okafor had placed on the table with the expression of someone who recognized the shape of a thing even before it was opened. Okafor opened it. Master Sergeant Claire Dempsey, she said, served with the Army Medical Service Corps for 14 years across 2 operational deployments and multiple training assignments. During the period between 2007 and 2009, she served under the command of then Lieutenant Colonel Owen Harding, who was subsequently found by this investigation to have deliberately suppressed, altered, or failed to process the following personnel actions. She turned a page. Bronze Star with Valor Device, awarded for actions on March 14, 2009, in which Sergeant Dempsey performed emergency combat triage on 6 wounded personnel in a collapsed structure while under active fire, preventing the loss of 4 lives. This commendation was approved at brigade level, signed by the brigade commander, and never entered into Master Sergeant Dempsey's official record. Fowler made a small sound that wasn't quite audible as a word. Ashby looked at Claire. She kept her face where it was. Additionally, Okafor continued, 2 meritorious service commendations from the preceding deployment, both approved, neither recorded. And an evaluation report from the 2008 training cycle at Kilo Base was altered to remove specific notations regarding Master Sergeant Dempsey's performance as a combat rescue instructor. She closed the folder. Harding has been formally charged. The charges are pending court-martial. The room processed this. It took a moment. These were not people accustomed to sitting in rooms where federal charges against military officers were described as footnotes to a nursing complaint review, and the recalibration required was visible across most of the faces at the table. Hartley spoke first. And the relationship between this investigation and the complaint before this panel? No direct relationship, Okafor said. The complaint is Harlow's matter to resolve. The IG's role here is to ensure the panel has the corrected record. What the panel does with it is the panel's business. Dillard, who had not spoken, spoke then. The complaint alleged negligent care by a nurse whose clinical background was characterized as limited. The corrected record suggests that characterization was substantively inaccurate. He said it without edge, without accusation, just as a statement of observable fact, which was somehow more damning than any pointed version would have been. Derek Voss moved, not toward a seat. He came fully into the room, past Marsh, past the IG team, to a position near the corner where he could see his father and the panel simultaneously. He was in civilian clothes again, the pressed jacket from the cafeteria, as if he'd worn the same thing for 3 consecutive days of this, which was possible and which had the quality of a detail that meant something about how he'd been spending the hours. He looked at Okafor's folder on the table, then at his father. "You knew," he said. Quiet. To the general. Raymond Voss looked at his son for the first time since he'd come into the room. "Yes. You knew who she was when they admitted you. I knew her name when you told me. I confirmed the rest after." The general's voice was measured in the way of someone choosing their words with the awareness that every word was being observed. "I was going to tell you." "When?" "When you stopped acting like a man who'd already decided." Something moved through Derek Voss's face that was not comfortable to watch, the specific expression of someone absorbing a precise and accurate criticism from a person whose precision they cannot dismiss. He looked away from his father. He looked at Claire. She returned his look steadily. "I didn't know," he said. Not an apology. Not a question. Just a statement laid on the table like a tool that might or might not be useful. "I know," she said. "The complaint—" He stopped. Garrison said carefully, "Commander Voss, any statement you make in this proceeding may be relevant to subsequent proceedings. You may want to—" "I want to withdraw it," Voss said. Garrison paused. "The complaint." "Yes, that's your right. However, the panel has been convened and documentation has been presented, which means the review will likely proceed to a formal finding regardless. Withdrawing the complaint at this stage affects the administrative process, but doesn't necessarily—" "I understand," Voss said. "I'm withdrawing it anyway." He said it with the particular flatness of someone who has run the calculation and arrived at the answer that costs him the most, and has decided to pay it anyway, not because it's comfortable, but because the alternative is something they've decided they won't be. Claire watched him do this. She had expected
She realized she had expected something more embattled. A man of Derek Voss's type didn't typically fold this cleanly. They usually found a middle position, a managed retreat, a way to concede the ground while maintaining the narrative. She had seen this pattern enough times to have cataloged it. He wasn't doing that. She wasn't sure what to do with that. Lundholm said, "The panel will take a brief recess,"
which was administrative language for "we need 15 minutes to figure out what just happened and how to manage it." The room rearranged itself, people stepping out, small conversations forming, the general being wheeled to a corner by the orderly, who had the look of someone who had been awake for a very long time. Diane appeared at Claire's shoulder. "You okay?" Diane said. "I'm fine." Still a reflex.
Still true. Claire looked at the window, at the Colorado morning outside it, unremarkable and bright. What happens now? The panel reconvenes, probably in 30 minutes. They make a formal finding. Given everything that just happened, the finding is going to be in your favor. That's not a question anymore. The question is how they frame it and what happens to the reassignment. Diane paused. And what happens to Voss? That's not my department. No, Diane said, but it's going to happen in front of you either way. She was right. The recess lasted 23 minutes. Claire spent part of it in the hallway near the water fountain, not because she was thirsty, but because the conference room had the particular airless quality of spaces where institutional decisions were being made, and she needed to not be in it for a moment. Marsh found her there. "How are you holding up?" he said, which was almost exactly what Diane had said, and which was the thing people said when they wanted to ask a more complex question. "Tell me about Harding," she said. "What does the court-martial look like?" Marsh leaned against the wall beside her. "Strong case. He kept records, which was either arrogance or stupidity, and with Harding the line was always blurry. We have documentation of the deliberate alterations. We have testimony from 4 other soldiers whose records he manipulated. Yours is the most significant because of the Bronze Star, but it's not isolated." He paused. "He'll lose his pension, likely lose his rank at separation. Possible confinement, though that's up to the court." "What was his reason for doing it?" Marsh was quiet for a moment. "Best we can tell, career management. Certain commendations in his unit drew attention upward. He wanted to control who got noticed. He suppressed 4 soldiers' Bronze Stars so he could manage who got noticed. And other commendations? Yes." She thought about that. The specific pettiness of it. The weight of what it meant. Not just for her, but for whatever version of herself had believed, for the 2 years after separation before she stopped waiting, that the paperwork was coming, had looked for it, had finally stopped looking. "He didn't think it would matter," she said. "He thought we'd all just move on." "Most people do," Marsh said. "He was almost right," she said. Marsh looked at her with something that was not quite sympathy and not quite admiration, but somewhere in the vicinity of both. "You should come back," he said. "To the Corps. As a civilian contractor, at minimum. We have programs." "I'm a nurse," she said. "You're also other things." "I'm a nurse," she said again, and the repetition was not argument. It was clarification. "This is what I am now. This is the choice I made. That choice doesn't become unmade because someone is standing in front of me offering me a different one." He didn't push. The panel reconvened at 11:12. Ashby spoke, which was significant because the chief of medical staff didn't typically read findings. His being the one to do it meant Harlow had decided this was a leadership moment, not an administrative one. "The panel has reviewed the complete clinical record and the additional documentation provided by the Inspector General's office," he said. "The finding is as follows. The clinical care provided to patient Raymond Voss by Nurse Claire Dempsey on the evening of November 18th met and in several instances exceeded the standard of care. The complaint of negligent delay is not supported by the documented timeline. The formal complaint is dismissed." He paused. "Furthermore," he said, "the panel finds that the precautionary reassignment of Ms. Dempsey was made on the basis of an incomplete understanding of her clinical background and professional record. That reassignment is rescinded, effective immediately. Ms. Dempsey is reinstated to her position in the ICU with no adverse notation in her personnel file." Fowler was looking at her hands. Hartley was looking at Lundholm with the particular expression of a board member who has successfully managed a situation that could have been considerably worse and wants that management acknowledged. Lundholm was looking at no one specifically,
which was also a kind of acknowledgement.
Additionally, Ashby said, and something in his tone shifted slightly. Less formal, not less serious. This panel recommends that hospital administration review its complaint intake process to ensure that precautionary reassignments are not initiated before clinical record review is complete. That was the panel's way of saying, this shouldn't have happened the way it happened without naming who had made it happen, which was the institutional version of accountability. Real enough to mean something, managed enough to not blow up in anyone's face. Derek Voss accepted this. He was still in the room, standing near the corner, and he accepted the finding without visible objection. Without visible anything, really. He had gone somewhere interior that Claire recognized because she had been to similar places herself. Not shut down. The opposite. The place you went when too many things were happening at once, and the only functional response was to let them happen and process afterward. Raymond Voss, in his wheelchair, made a sound that might have been acknowledgement and might have been something closer to relief. He was looking at Claire. She met his eyes. Something passed between them that required no language. The specific recognition of two people who had been in serious situations together and who each understood what the other had understood in those situations and who did not need to summarize it. The general nodded once, a small deliberate movement, and Claire returned it in kind. Then the room started to decompress. People moved and talked and gathered their materials, the specific choreography of a proceeding that is concluded and now needs to convert itself back into a building full of ordinary professional activity. Okafor shook Claire's hand with the brisk warmth of someone who had seen many of these moments and found them meaningful without finding them surprising. Dillard said something brief and accurate about the clinical record. Weil, the DOD attorney, handed her a card and said nothing, but her expression said, "Call. If you need anything procedural," and Claire pocketed the card. Diane was beside her when the room had mostly cleared, looking at her with the professional satisfaction of someone who had walked into a situation correctly. "I see you," Diane said. "Monday morning." "Monday morning," Claire confirmed. She was gathering her things when she heard Derek Voss behind her. "Dempsey." She turned. He was alone in the doorway. His father had been taken back down the hall, the orderly and a nurse visible retreating toward the elevator. He looked like someone who had been awake for too long and had too many things he was still working through and had decided to do this anyway. "I need to say something," he said. "You don't have to. I know I don't." He stopped, started differently. "I was wrong. About the care. About how I—" He seemed to find the word insufficient once he had it. "About how I handled everything in that bay. That night. The things I said." She looked at him. He was holding his jacket in his hands. She noticed this, the fact that he'd taken it off at some point during the recess and was now carrying it instead of wearing it, the specific vulnerability of that, the body making an adjustment that the face was still too controlled to make. "You were scared," she said. "Not as an excuse, as a fact. That's not a defense." "No, it's just true." He looked at her for a moment. "You saved his life. I flagged something early. Sung performed the procedure." "You know that's not the whole story." She picked up her bag. "Your father's going to need 2 to 3 weeks of careful monitoring post-procedure. Make sure whoever he sees as an outpatient has the full echocardiogram series, not just the admission echo. The LV wall motion finding needs to be rechecked at 4 weeks." He blinked. The shift from interpersonal to clinical was deliberate on her part, and she thought he knew it. And she also thought he recognized it as the kind of thing you let a person do when they need to do it. "I'll make sure," he said. She nodded and walked past him. In the hallway, she passed Marsh, who was talking on his phone, and he made eye contact and gave the small nod of someone who would follow up later. And she kept walking, through the administrative wing, past the elevators, to the stairwell, because the stairwell was direct. She took the stairs. She was on the 3rd floor when her phone buzzed. A text from an internal Harlow number, Marcus. "Bay 6. General's back in room. He's asking for you." She stopped on the landing between floors. She thought about the photograph in the general's lap, the unit photograph from the end of a deployment that felt like a different century. Her own face in the 2nd row, younger, carrying a medic bag,
looking at the camera with the direct expression of someone who was not yet aware of the specific ways the next 17 years were going to rearrange her. She thought about, I knew her name when you told me. She went back up. Bay 6 had been reorganized since the acute phase. Monitors still present, but in a lower acuity configuration. The room less crowded with equipment. The particular atmosphere of a space transitioning from crisis to recovery. Raymond Voss was back in the bed, and the orderly who'd been with him downstairs was gone. And the day shift nurse, not Petra today, a young man Claire didn't know well named Carter, was updating the chart at the room computer and looked up when she came in. He asked for you specifically, Carter said, with the slightly uncertain quality of someone who wasn't sure of the interpersonal dynamics and had decided not to assume. I know, Claire said. Give us a few minutes. Carter left. She pulled a chair to the bedside and sat, which she didn't usually do. Usually she stood, because standing was more efficient. But this was not that kind of visit, and she was tired in a way that sitting addressed, and the general was 71 in post-procedure and had discharged himself against medical advice to attend a panel meeting and could probably use the visual cue that she was not in a hurry. He looked better than he had at 3 a.m. Still depleted, the procedure and the recovery and the ill-advised AMA discharge had taken something visible from him. But he was present. The eyes were sharp. Sit like that and you'll ruin your back, he said. I've been ruining my back since 2004, she said. Something almost like a smile. Kilo base, he said. I wasn't there for most of it, but I read the after-action reports. All of them? The ones that weren't buried. He adjusted his position, which took effort that he didn't let her see him making. Harding sent me a copy of your evaluation, the altered one. I didn't know it was altered at the time. If I had... He stopped. I would like to say I would have done something. I'm not certain that's true. It was 2009, and I was managing my own transition, and I had my own... He made a gesture that encompassed things he wasn't going to enumerate. I don't know what I would have done. She appreciated the honesty. It was the rarest thing in rooms like the conference room downstairs, and it was the rarest thing from men of his rank, and she had always respected it when it appeared regardless of the source. The Bronze Star, he said. March 14th. I read the report twice. He looked at her. 6 people. 4 survived. 4 survived because of what you did. 2 didn't, she said. That's also what happened. He absorbed that. The way old soldiers absorbed casualty numbers. Not flinching, not performing, just carrying. You stayed, he said, after separation. You stayed in the work. Different form, same work. He looked at the window. My son, Derek. The name in his mouth had the quality of something he'd held for a long time and was still figuring out how to carry. He's a good officer. He's become, in some ways, a better officer than I was. But he has a... The general paused, and what happened in the pause was something that happened in the faces of parents when they were being honest about their children in front of a stranger. A specific kind of exposure. He learned authority young. It's the thing I did wrong, in terms of how I raised him. I let him confuse confidence with competence too early. He knew enough to back down when it mattered, Claire said. He knew enough tonight. He didn't know enough Monday. People are different at different hours. The general looked at her with the expression of someone who recognized a specific kind of generosity and was noting it. You're more charitable to him than I am, he said. He's not my son. That landed somewhere. They sat for a moment with the particular silence of 2 people who had said enough and were letting it settle. The record, the general said then. The commendations, what are you going to do with them? Nothing. He looked at her. Nothing. They're mine. They'll be in my file. I'm not putting them on a wall. She looked at the window. I went where the work was. I did the work. The paperwork is just paper. Most people. I'm not most people. She said it without any edge. The same words Derek Voss had provoked from her in the cafeteria. Different frequency now. The general's expression shifted into something that was finally openly moved. Not sentimental, not the theatrical emotion of a man performing gratitude, but the specific, quiet expression of someone who has looked at a thing for a long time and finally sees it clearly. I'm going to write a letter, he said, to Harlow administration, formally, acknowledging what happened and what you did and what should have been done differently. He paused. I'm also going to write to the IG's office, as a character witness in the Harding proceedings. You don't owe me either of those things, she said. No, he said. I don't. He looked at her directly. I'm going to do them anyway. She stood. She checked his monitor readings, because she was still a nurse and this was still her ICU, even if she wasn't technically on shift. And the numbers were where they should be, and his color was better than it had been this morning. Rest, she said, and Monday, when I'm back, you'd better be in step down and not still in my ICU. Bossy, he said, for a nurse. 17 years, she said. She left him there. The hallway outside Bay 6 was quiet in the mid-afternoon way of hospital corridors. The acute morning activity settled into the steadier rhythm of ongoing care. She stood for a moment at the nurse's station, her nurse's station. She was aware of that specifically now, reinstated, the reassignment rescinded, and looked at the monitors and the charts and the unremarkable functional equipment of a life she had built and chosen and was, it turned out, going to be allowed to keep. Lena appeared from the supply room. She stopped when she saw Claire. You're back, she said. Not a question. Monday. Today? Today I'm off the clock. Lena looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who has a great deal they want to say and is editing it in real time. Did they? Yes. And Voss withdrew it. Lena processed this, then, how are you actually feeling? I'm fine. Claire. She looked at Lena, who had been her colleague for 3 years, who checked potassium levels when she told her to and had appeared in the East Wing specifically to bring her information when she needed it, and who looked, right now, like a person who genuinely wanted to know. I'm tired, Claire said. It was the most honest answer she had. Lena nodded. Go home. We've got it. She was in the elevator, going down, when her phone buzzed again. This time it was a number she recognized. Diane. She answered. One more thing, Diane said, with a tone that Claire had learned meant this is the thing that complicates everything else. Tell me. Lundholm called me 20 minutes ago. Hospital administration is convening a separate review, not of your care. A pause. Of Harding. Of whether Owen Harding's record manipulation affected other nursing or medical staff who trained through military channels and were subsequently hired by Harlow. She stopped. The elevator arrived at the ground floor. She didn't move. How many? She asked. They don't know yet. That's the point of the review. They've identified 14 clinical staff who served in the same operational period. They don't know how many have incomplete records. They don't know who else was suppressed. Diane paused again. Claire, if Harding did this to you and he did it to 4 others in the IG investigation, the IG thinks he may have done it to as many as 20 personnel over his command tenure. The lobby moved around her. Visitors, staff, the ordinary populated motion of a hospital in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. 20 personnel. 20 people who might have left the military with altered records, with missing commendations, with evaluations that said something other than what had actually happened. 20 people who had, like her, at some point, stopped waiting for paperwork that was never coming. The hospital review, she said. They want to know if I'll cooperate as a witness and assist with identifying affected personnel. Yes, it would be voluntary. But you know this system. You know how to read the records and spot the alterations. She stood in the lobby of Harlow Medical Center, her bag over her shoulder, 17 years of carefully constructed distance behind her, and a very specific set of skills in front of her. Send me the details, she said. Claire, I said send me the details. She put the phone in her pocket and walked through the lobby and through the automatic doors and out into the Colorado afternoon, which was cold and clear and had the particular quality of air that came after something difficult had moved through it. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. 20 people. Maybe more. She was tired. She was genuinely bone-level tired in the way of someone who had spent 3 days managing a situation that would have broken a different person, and she had the weekend before Monday, and she could spend those 2 days sleeping and eating and not being in a hospital. She could do that. She thought about a unit photograph, about second rows, about a footnote in a nonprofit database and a training exercise in November cold and a lieutenant's thumb pressing against the side of a radio. She thought about what Raymond Voss had said. Same work, different form. She was still standing on the sidewalk when her phone buzzed a third time. This time, it was a number she had never seen. Colorado Springs area code. No name in her contacts. She answered. The voice was female, young, careful. Is this Claire Dempsey? The nurse from Harlow Medical Center ICU. Yes. My name is Sergeant First Class Dana Reyes. I'm currently stationed at Fort Carson. A pause, and in it something she recognized from long experience. The particular hesitation of a person who has been carrying something difficult and has finally made the decision to set it down somewhere. I was given your number by Colonel Marsh. He said you might be someone I could talk to. Another pause. I served under Owen Harding, 2011 to 2013, and I think... She stopped. I know my record isn't right. I've known for years. I just didn't know what to do about it. Claire stood on the sidewalk outside Harlow Medical Center in the cold Colorado afternoon. I know exactly what to do about it, she said. Inside the hospital, on the 6th floor in Bay 6, Raymond Voss was resting. In the conference room where the panel had convened, the folders were being filed. On the floors above and below and around, the work of a hospital continued, uninterrupted, as it always did. And in the administrative system, still processing, still moving through channels, a formal complaint that had been withdrawn, but whose consequences were not done arriving, the precise shape of which was about to become clear in a way that Derek Voss had not anticipated and had no remaining ability to manage. Because Hartley had made 2 phone calls during the recess, and one of them had not been to Lundholm. Hartley's second phone call had gone to Vice Admiral Susan Pratt. Claire didn't know this until Saturday morning when Marsh called her at 8:47 a.m. while she was standing in her kitchen making eggs she was only half paying attention to. You should know what's moving, he said, without preamble. She turned the burner down. Tell me. Margaret Hartley sits on the board of 2 organizations, Harlow Medical Center and the Colorado Veterans Healthcare Advocacy Coalition. She made a call Friday afternoon to Admiral Pratt, who chairs the coalition's Military Affairs Committee and who also, relevant detail, sits on the Senate Armed Services Committee's advisory panel on personnel records integrity. A pause. Pratt made 3 calls of her own yesterday afternoon. One to the IG's office, which Okafor already told me about, one to her counterpart at the DoD Inspector General, and one to a reporter at the Denver Post named Ellison who covers Veterans Affairs. Claire set her spatula down. How much did she give the reporter? She asked. Enough to run something, framed around Harding and the suppressed records. Your name is in it, but Pratt apparently insisted on your authorization before Ellison used it. He paused again. Ellison called me this morning asking for a comment from the IG's office. I told him to call you first. He hasn't called. He will. Probably within the hour. Marsh's voice had the careful quality it got when he was navigating between what he was supposed to say and what he actually thought. Claire, this is going to be bigger than a hospital complaint review. The Harding story. The full scope of it. 20-plus affected personnel. A deliberate pattern, a court-martial pending. That's a significant story. And you're the most visible case. She stood in her kitchen in the Saturday morning quiet, looking at the eggs she was no longer making. She thought about visibility, about the 17 years of deliberate low profile, about the choice she'd made when she left. Not to disappear, but to put the distance between herself and a version of her life that had cost her things she'd never fully accounted for to anyone, including herself. What happens if I decline the interview? She asked. The story runs without your account. Harding is still the center of it. Your name is still in it, probably. And Ellison fills in the gaps with what he can find, which, given what's publicly documented now, is considerable. He waited. Or you give him 30 minutes, and the story has your voice in it. Your actual account. She looked at the eggs. I'll call him, she said. The call with Ellison lasted 47 minutes, not 30. He was good. The kind of reporter who listened more than he talked and asked follow-up questions that were actually about what she'd said rather than what he'd already planned to write. She told him what she was willing to tell him, which was more than she'd expected when she picked up the phone. She told him about the flags she'd made in the personnel system and how she'd eventually stopped waiting.
She told him about the night of November 18th, the clinical facts, the timeline, the outcome. She did not tell him about Kilo Base or November 2008, not because she was protecting Derek Voss, but because that story wasn't hers alone to tell.
When he asked about a complaint, she said, "The record speaks for itself." When he asked about Harding, she said, "He made decisions that had consequences for people who trusted the system to work correctly. The system is now correcting itself. That's what it's supposed to do." When he asked how she felt about being reinstated, she was quiet for a moment. "I feel like I need to go back to work Monday," she said. He printed that line. She found out later it was the closing line of the piece. The story ran Sunday morning. She read it at her kitchen table with coffee that was actually good this time because she had made it carefully, because it was Sunday and she had the time. It was on the front page of the Metro section, not the front page of the paper, which she wouldn't have wanted, but prominent, above the fold. The headline was straightforward: Army investigates suppressed military records. As Colorado nurse's case exposes broader pattern. Ellison had written it cleanly, without editorializing. The facts arranged in an order that made the shape of what Harding had done clearly visible without requiring embellishment. Her name was in paragraph 4. Her record, the corrected record, was in paragraph 6. The Bronze Star was mentioned without fanfare, 2 sentences, accurate. The part that surprised her was paragraph 11. Ellison had talked to Raymond Voss. She hadn't known that. The general had apparently called the reporter directly, had asked for the conversation off the record initially and then on the record after, and had said, in the 2 sentences Ellison quoted, both of which he'd clearly been authorized to print, that Claire Dempsey was, in his direct experience, one of the most capable medical professionals he had encountered in 4 decades of service, and that what had been done to her record was a failure of the institution he had served, and that he was prepared to say so as many times and in as many venues as necessary. She read those sentences twice. She set the paper down. She sat with it for a while. The thing about being seen, really seen, not performed at or processed through or managed, was that you didn't always know how much you needed it until it happened. And then you felt the shape of the space that had existed before it, and the shape was larger than you'd admitted. She drank her coffee. She was not crying. She was also not pretending the sensation in her chest was nothing. She called Dana Reyes at 11 o'clock. They had talked twice since the initial call on Friday. Once Saturday morning, once Saturday evening, longer conversations, more specific. Dana's situation was different from hers in the details, and similar in the architecture. A record that didn't reflect what had happened, commendations that had been approved and then hadn't appeared. The particular confusion of someone who had done the right things and couldn't account for why the official version of their service looked like they hadn't. Reyes was 34, direct, with the quality of someone who had been waiting for a specific door to open and was now standing in front of it, and was not entirely sure what was behind it. "Did you see the article?" Reyes asked when she picked up. "I saw it. My name isn't in it." "Not yet. That's your choice to make." A pause. "Is it worth it? The visibility? All of—" She gestured verbally at everything the question contained. Claire thought about it honestly, which meant she didn't answer immediately. "It's not comfortable," she said. "It's also not optional, in the sense that the thing that happened to your record happened regardless of whether you talk about it. The question is whether your account is part of how it gets addressed." She paused. "You served. You did the work. You deserve to have your record say what happened." "I know that." A shorter pause. "I just needed to hear it from someone who'd actually done it." "I know," Claire said. Monday morning, she was back in the ICU at 7 a.m., which was 15 minutes before her shift technically started. But the ICU at 7 a.m. had a specific quality she had missed in the 4 days she'd been on the general medical floors, and she was not going to pretend she hadn't missed it. Petra was finishing the overnight shift, looking like someone who had been awake for 11 hours in a row, which she had, and who was very pleased to see Claire standing at the workstation, which she was. "Base 6 discharged to step down Saturday morning," Petra said, "like you told him to." "Good. He left something for you." Petra reached under the desk and produced an envelope. Plain, sealed, Claire's name on the front in handwriting that was deliberate and slightly formal. She looked at it and put it in her pocket. "What's the census?" she asked. Petra gave her the rundown. 7 patients, 3 requiring close monitoring, 1 new admission overnight who was stable but complex. Claire listened and made notes and asked 2 clarifying questions, and then Petra went home and Claire went to work. She opened the envelope at 9:30 during a quiet 15 minutes at the workstation. Inside was a single card, not hospital issue, something from outside, good paper, the kind you bought intentionally. The general's handwriting. "You told me rank doesn't save lives. I've been thinking about that since you said it. I think you're right, and I think it's more important than it sounds. Thank you for understanding the difference between those things when it mattered. R. Boss." Below the signature in slightly different ink, like it had been added after, "My son wants to say something to you. I told him he should do it himself. He will, when he figures out how." She folded the card and put it back in the envelope. She thought about what it cost a man like Raymond Voss to write that. The specific cost of it, not the sentiment, which probably came easily to him by now, but the act, the sitting down, the choosing words, the acknowledgement, in writing, that a person he outranked by every conventional measure had understood something he was still working on. She tucked the envelope in her bag and went back to the charts. The official proceedings caught up with Owen Harding on a Wednesday. Claire wasn't in the room. She was never going to be in the room for the procedural parts. That was Okafor's domain, and the IG's, and the court-martial boards. But Diane called her at 6:15 p.m. as Claire was finishing documentation at the end of her shift, and the call was short. "He entered a guilty plea," Diane said, "to all charges." She stopped writing. "When?" "This afternoon, 2 p.m. Apparently his attorney advised him that the evidence was—" A dry pause. "Comprehensive. The plea covers the deliberate record alteration for all 23 affected personnel. 23, Claire. They found 3 more in the last week." 23. "The sentencing?" she asked. 90 days confinement, reduction to the lowest enlisted grade, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, dishonorable discharge." Diane paused. "He loses the pension. He loses the rank. He leaves the Army as the lowest possible grade after 31 years of service." She absorbed this. Outside the workstation windows, the Colorado evening was doing its thing. The specific quality of mountain-adjacent dusk, the light going sideways and amber before it gave up entirely. "The 23, she said. "The IG is processing all the records. All 23 have been formally notified. The record corrections are in process. The ones who are still in service will have their personnel files corrected before end of month. The veterans, like you, have already had corrections filed." A pause. 7 of them called the IG's office after the article ran. They'd been carrying incomplete records for years, didn't know there was anything to be done about it. 7 people who read a story in a Sunday newspaper and made a phone call. She thought about that, about the specific geometry of it. 1 case, 1 night, 1 complaint that had moved through an administrative system in a direction no one had predicted, and at the other end of the chain, 7 people picking up phones. "Thank you," she said to Diane, "for all of it." "That's my job," Diane said, and then more quietly, "But also, yes, you're welcome." She put her phone away. Lena appeared at the end of the station carrying something in both hands. A box, white, with a bakery sticker on top. She set it on the counter with the slightly performative casualness of someone executing a plan they'd thought about. "What's that?" Claire said. "Cake." "Why?" "Because you've had a weird week, and also because Marcus bought it and wanted to do some kind of thing, and I told him to let me handle it because he would have made it awkward." Claire looked at the box. "Who told him?" she asked. "The article ran Sunday," Lena said. "Everyone read it. Marcus cried a little bit, which he will deny, and Karen from the desk made a comment about feeling dumb for not knowing, and I told her it wasn't her job to know and she should focus on that." She paused. "We're all just—" She stopped herself and tried again. "We wanted you to know that we're glad you're back, that it matters that you're here." Claire looked at the box for a long moment. She thought about the years, the 14 in uniform, and the 17 since. The specific accumulation of moments that added up to a person who stood in an ICU on a Tuesday night and felt fully and without armor that she was in the right place. "Open the box," she said. The next Thursday, she walked into a conference room for the second time in 2 weeks. This one was different in every material way from the panel review. It was at Fort Carson, Building 1040, the same conference room where she'd met Okafor. But the room had been rearranged and there were more people in it, 12 by her count, seated around a table that had been extended with a second folding section. Some in uniform, some in civilian clothes, most with the quality that she had learned to identify across 17 years of working adjacent to it. The quality of people who had done difficult things in difficult places and had continued to exist afterward and were navigating what that meant. The 23 had been invited. 11 had come in person. The other 12 were joining remotely, split across 6 states, on a video system that was slightly too small for the room but was functional. She was not running this meeting. Okafor was. Marsh had organized it. Claire was there as a witness and, at Okafor's request, as a resource. Someone who knew the operational period, who could read the records and explain what the alterations meant in concrete terms. She sat near the middle of the table. The person to her left was a man named Kowalski, 62, retired, who had driven from Pueblo that morning and who had the build of someone who had once been very strong and was not apologizing for what time had done to that. He'd been a medic. His record was missing a commendation from 2007. He'd known about it for 15 years and had done nothing because he hadn't known what to do and because at some point the anger had become too expensive to maintain. He introduced himself with his rank and name and then said, "I don't really know why I'm here." "Because it happened to you," Claire said, "and because someone is finally doing something about it." He looked at her with the specific expression of someone deciding whether to trust that. Then he nodded, once, and looked at the front of the room where Okafor was getting started. The meeting ran 3 hours. By the end of it, all 11 people in the room, and most of the 12 remote, had asked at least one question, had been given at least one concrete answer, and had been told specifically what the correction of their record would mean, and what the timeline was, and who to contact for each subsequent step. 3 of them had additional details the IG team hadn't known about. Specific incidents, specific supervisors, specific dates that Dillard was noting carefully for the record. When Okafor called the end of the formal session and the room started to decompress, Kowalski turned to Claire. "That woman," he said, nodding toward Okafor, "is terrifying in the best possible way." "Yes," Claire said. "You're not so bad yourself." She almost smiled. "I'm a nurse." "Right," he said, in the tone of someone who had sat in the room for 3 hours and was not especially persuaded by that sentence as a complete description of what she was. She drove back to Colorado Springs in the late afternoon. She was almost at her exit when her phone rang through the car speakers. Unknown number, Colorado Springs area code. She answered. "Ms. Dempsey." The voice was Derek Voss, which she had identified before he gave his name. "It's Derek Voss." "I know." A pause. "My father said you'd know." She took her exit. "What can I do for you, Commander?" "I wanted—" He stopped. Started differently, which she had noticed was something he did when the first approach wasn't working. "I've been trying to figure out how to do this correctly, and I think maybe there isn't a correct way, so I'm just going to say it." "Go ahead." "I'm sorry. For what I said in the ICU that night, for the complaint, for the reassignment that happened because of how I handled—" He paused again. "For all of it, specifically, not as a category." She drove. The Colorado afternoon moved past the windows. "I'm not asking for anything in return," he said. "I'm not asking you to say it's okay, because what I did wasn't okay and I don't want you to tell me it was." Another pause. "I just didn't want to not say it." She was quiet for a moment. "I accept it," she said. "You don't have to." "I know. I'm choosing to." She turned onto her street. "Your father is going to need that 4-week echo. Make sure he keeps the appointment." "He will. I'll drive him myself." "Good." She pulled into her parking space and sat for a moment with the engine off. "Kilo base," he said, and his voice had changed. Something had gone out of the controlled register into something less managed. "November 2008, I failed the assessment." She remembered. She had been his evaluator. He had frozen, not completely, not catastrophically, but enough, in a scenario where freezing had consequences. She had failed him on that specific assessment and passed him on the overall training cycle, and had written in her evaluation that he showed fundamental capability under pressure with a specific gap in autonomous decision-making that time and experience would address. She had not known what happened to that evaluation. She had not known Harding had altered it. "I know you failed it," she said. "I've thought about it a lot over the years. You passed the cycle. You passed me on the cycle," he said, "when you could have washed me out. I didn't understand that at the time. She could hear him finding words. "I was 26 and I thought I'd earned it, and I didn't understand that someone had made a judgment call about what I was capable of and had been generous with it." "I wasn't being generous," she said. "I was being accurate. The assessment failure was real. The overall evaluation was also real. Both things were true. I didn't appreciate that someone could see both things at once." "Most people can," she said, "when they're paying attention." A pause that had a different quality than his earlier pauses, less managed, more human. "I'm being investigated," he said. "My conduct during the ICU incident has been referred to my chain of command." She hadn't known this. Hartley's second call, she thought, or one of Pratt's 3. "I know," she said, because she understood enough now about what had been set in motion to understand that this was inevitable. "It's the right thing," he said. Flat. Resigned in a way that wasn't self-pity, just accurate. "What I did in that ICU was wrong. I used my rank to interfere with medical care, and I used a board connection to initiate a retaliatory complaint. And I should have consequences for that." She sat in her parked car. "Yes," she said, "you should." "I know, and you'll get through them," she said. Not softly, just as a statement of what she assessed to be true, the same way she assessed vitals. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Kilo base," he said finally. "You wrote something in the original evaluation, before Harding changed it. The IG showed me the corrected version." He paused. "You wrote that I had the instincts, but not yet the trust in them. That once I learned to trust my own judgment, I'd be a good officer." She remembered writing something like that, 17 years ago, in a field tent, on a form that had subsequently disappeared. "I remember," she said. Was it true? She thought about the man she'd watched in the ICU on Monday night. Not that Derek Voss, the earlier one, the one who'd been frightened and armored and wrong about nearly everything, and about the man who had stood in the conference room doorway and said, "I want to withdraw it," with the specific flatness of someone paying a cost they'd decided to pay. "You're the one who can answer that," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said, "for saving his life." "That's my job," she said, which was what Diane had said to her, and which was true in the same way and meant the same additional thing underneath it. She went inside and made dinner and ate it while it was still hot, which was not always how her evenings went, and she slept 8 hours, which was also not always how her nights went. She was back in the ICU at 7 a.m. The formal recognition came 3 weeks later, which was not how she would have arranged it if she'd had a choice, but she hadn't been given a choice, and by the time she understood what was happening, it was already organized. Harlow Medical Center held quarterly staff recognition events, low-key affairs, usually a Friday afternoon in the main conference room, the kind of institutional acknowledgement that was more about morale than ceremony. The one in December was different, and she knew it was going to be different when Ashby called her Wednesday and said, with the careful tone of someone who anticipated pushback, "I want to brief you on Friday's event before you read about it somewhere else." She said, "How many people?" "Staff, invited guests, some media. The board wants to be present. We've also had..." He paused. "Some external requests." Define external. Representatives from the Colorado Veterans Healthcare Advocacy Coalition, Colonel Marsh and 2 members of the IG team, and a shorter pause. "General Voss has asked to attend. He's been cleared for outpatient activity." She sat with that. "I'm not comfortable with ceremony," she said. "I know. Dr. Fowler said you would say that." Something in his voice that was almost humor. "She also said I should tell you that it isn't actually about your comfort." She thought about 7 people who had called the IG's office after a Sunday newspaper article, about Kowalski driving from Pueblo, about Dinah Reyes on the phone with the specific hesitation of someone who needed to hear it from someone who'd done it.
"Fine," she said. The room was larger than she'd expected. The main conference room held 120 people comfortably. They'd set it for 140, and it was nearly full by the time she arrived, walking in from the side entrance with Diane, who had declined to let her walk in alone on the basis that solidarity was part of the job, and also she wanted to see this.
There were people she recognized. The ICU staff, most of them. Marcus with the expression of someone who had decided in advance that he was going to feel things and was at peace with that. Lena with the expression of someone who had helped organize this and was managing the logistics internally while pretending to be a casual attendee. Petra, Carter, Nancy. There were people she didn't recognize, civilian clothes, some with the specific bearing that told her they were, or had been, military. Some who looked like journalists, some who looked like administrators from institutions she didn't work for. There was Kowalski, standing near the back, in a jacket that looked like it was from a good occasion from a different decade and had been brought back out for this one. There was Dana Reyes in uniform, standing straight, looking like someone who had decided something about herself in the last 2 weeks and was still getting used to how it felt. There was Raymond Voss in a chair near the front, not a wheelchair today, a regular chair, which told her something about his recovery and also about his determination, sitting with the bearing of a man who had earned the right to take up space and knew it. Derek Voss was not there. She had not expected him to be, and she noticed that she'd noticed his absence, and she filed that away without judgment. Ashby spoke first. He was direct and non-theatrical about it, which she appreciated. The facts, the timeline, the clinical record, the IG investigation, the 23 personnel, the implications. He didn't perform emotion at the audience. He delivered information and trusted the information to do the work. Hartley spoke next, briefly, from the board's perspective. She was precise and specific about what the hospital intended to do differently in terms of complaint intake procedures and precautionary reassignment protocols. Accountability stated plainly, in front of a room, with media present. Claire was aware of how unusual this was, for an institution to stand in front of people and say, "We got this wrong. And here is specifically how we are changing it." Most institutions dissolved accountability into passive voice and future-facing language. Hartley wasn't doing that. Marsh spoke about the IG investigation in terms he was authorized to speak about publicly. He named Harding once, clearly, with the specific naming of someone who wants a record to exist. He spoke about the 23 personnel with the precise weight of someone who understood that numbers had people inside them. Then Ashby came back to the microphone and said, "I'd like to ask Nurse Dempsey to come forward." She went. She was not comfortable at the front of a room. She had never been the kind of person who found visibility natural, had spent most of her adult life actively managing away from it. She stood at the front of the room with 140 people looking at her and felt exactly as uncomfortable as she'd expected, and did it anyway, because the room wasn't actually about her, and knowing that made it manageable. Ashby said a number of things. She heard them without fully absorbing them. The formal language of recognition, the specific commendations, the reinstatement stated publicly, the hospital's expression of what she had done and what it meant. She stood through it with the particular stillness of someone who has learned that there are moments you do not try to manage. You simply occupy them and let them pass. Then Raymond Voss stood up. He wasn't supposed to, by any medical guideline that would have applied 3 weeks ago, and she could see from the way he moved that it cost him something, and he did it anyway with the deliberateness of a man who had decided that some statements needed to be made on your feet. He said, "I want to add something with the room's permission." Nobody told him he didn't have it. He looked at Claire. "I was her patient," he said. "I want to say that clearly, because I think it matters for this room to understand what that means. Not in the abstract, specifically. I was her patient on a night when the outcome could have gone a different way, and the reason it didn't was because she was paying attention when it would have been easier not to be." He paused. "I also knew her before that, not personally, but I knew her record, or I thought I did. I've since learned what her record actually contains, and the gap between what I knew and what is true is significant." He looked at his hands for a moment. "I spent 40 years in the army," he said, I learned over those years to have significant confidence in the institution. I still do, in the ways that confidence is earned. But institutions are composed of people, and people sometimes make decisions that the institution does not actually sanction, and when that happens, the institution has an obligation to correct it. What happened to this woman's record was a failure of that obligation. He looked up. What is happening now is the correction. I am grateful to be here to see it. He sat back down. The room was quiet for a moment, with the particular quality of a silence that has weight in it. Claire looked at him. He looked back, and what was on his face was the thing she hadn't been able to read on the night of November 18th in Bay 6, when he'd said, "gave you trouble," and she'd thought the expression was complicated. She could read it now. It wasn't complicated. It was simple, and old, and honest. It was respect. She turned to the room. She had not prepared remarks. She hadn't wanted to prepare remarks because prepared remarks had a way of becoming the remarks instead of the truth. And she wanted to say the truth, even if the truth was shorter and less satisfying than what a prepared statement would have offered. "I'm a nurse," she said. "That's where I want to start, because I think sometimes when you find out that someone has another background, a different kind of background, the instinct is to explain what they're doing now through that lens, to say the nursing makes sense because of the military, or the military makes sense because of the nursing, or to look for the thread that connects them and decide that's the story." She paused. "I don't think that's the story." The room was with her. She could feel it the way you feel a room when it's actually listening. "I was a combat medic. I was good at it. I left. And then I became a nurse, and I'm good at that too. And those are related, but they are not the same thing." She looked at the room, at the specific faces in it: Lena, Kowalski, Dana Reyes, Ashby, Hartley, Raymond Voss. What connects them is not a skill set or a background. It's a decision made repeatedly to pay attention to the person in front of you, to not let the noise in the room, whatever noise, whoever's making it, move you away from that. The night that apparently brought all of you here, I was not performing courage or expertise. I was doing my job, which is to watch and to notice and to act on what I notice before the moment closes. She stopped. "The record matters," she said. "What happened to those 23 records matters. And I'm glad it's being corrected. And I'm glad Owen Harding is being held accountable. And I mean that clearly and without qualification." She looked at Kowalski specifically for a second. He held her gaze. "But the record doesn't make you who you are. You made those decisions without the record. You did those things without the commendation. So did I. The paper is late." The moment was real when it happened. She paused one more time. "That's all I have." The applause started before she finished stepping back from the microphone, and she stood through it with the same stillness she'd stood through everything else, not performing humility and not performing acceptance, just being in the room with what the room was. She found Kowalski afterward, near the coffee that someone had set up in the back. "Good speech," he said. "I didn't prepare it." "I know. That's why it was good." Dana Reyes appeared beside her, still in uniform, looking like someone who had decided to be here and was glad about the decision, but wasn't entirely sure what came next. "The IG called me Friday," she said. "My record is corrected. Staff Sergeant's evaluation, 2012. The notation's back in." "Good," Claire said. It felt— Reyes stopped. "Stranger than I expected. Like I thought I would feel more complete, and instead I just felt like someone handed me back something I'd forgotten I was missing." Claire thought about the corrected record she had looked at in Okafor's folder, about the specific sensation of seeing her own service reflected accurately for the first time in 17 years, the way it was smaller and larger than she'd expected simultaneously. "That's about right," she said. "Does it go away, that feeling?" "It changes," Claire said. "It doesn't go away, but it changes." She drove home at 7 p.m. and changed out of the clothes she'd worn to the event and made tea and sat at her kitchen table in the specific quiet of a Friday evening that had been a long week and was now over. She took the card from Raymond Voss out of her bag. She'd been carrying it since Monday. She read the last line again. "My son wants to say something to you. I told him he should do it himself. He will when he figures out how." She thought about Derek Voss's formal investigation. about the conduct review, the chain of command, the consequences that were already in process and would take their time and be what they were going to be. She thought about the specific look on his face in the conference room doorway when the photograph was in his father's lap, and he had finally understood what he was looking at. She thought about what the general had written. He will, when he figures out how. She set the card down.
She had no particular feelings about whether he figured it out. That was his work to do. She had her own. In the morning, she was going to call Okafor about the ongoing record review. There were 2 more cases the IG had flagged that needed someone who understood the operational period to review the documentation, and she had agreed to do it. In the afternoon, she was meeting Dana Reyes for coffee. Not officially, not as anything formal, just 2 people who had served and then navigated the aftermath of service in different directions, and who had ended up, on a Friday afternoon in Colorado Springs, with things in common worth understanding. On Monday, she was back in the ICU. That was the schedule. That was the life she had built and chosen and was, finally and fully, keeping. She sat at her kitchen table and drank her tea and thought about a thing she had understood for a long time without having the language for it. That the difference between the 2 kinds of strength was not loudness or size or record. The first kind announced itself. The first kind needed the room to register it. The second kind simply continued. In burning buildings, in collapsed structures, in ICU bays at midnight with cardiac monitors screaming and someone in dress whites telling you to leave. It continued because it had decided to continue, and because the work in front of it was real, and because the moment was real when it happened, paper or no paper, witness or no witness. She had been called just a nurse. She had been dismissed, investigated, reassigned, and finally seen. She was still a nurse. She was also, had always been, everything else. Those were not contradictions. They were the same person, showing up to the same work, in the same quiet that had always been, for people who understood what quiet could contain, the loudest thing in the room. She finished her tea. She washed the cup. She went to bed. She had work in the morning.